high above the jungles of Peru, where clouds swallow entire mountains. An ancient people built cities of stone on the impossible ridges. They buried their dead inside sheer cliffs, raised enormous walls above the forest, and resisted one of the greatest empires the Americas had ever seen. Then their cities fell silent. Who were the mysterious cloud warriors, and why did they choose to live so close to the sky? Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of ancient history and mystery you enjoy. Now, follow the mist into the lost world of the Chachapoya. The clouds close around the mountain before the ruins appear. One moment there is only wet stone, dripping leaves, and a narrow path climbing through the eastern Andes. The next, a wall rises from the mist, enormous and pale, its surface beaded with rain. Beyond it, hidden on a ridge more than 2,000 meters above sea level, lie the remains of a world that once looked east toward the Amazon and west toward the high Andes, belonging fully to neither. Here, where steep valleys plunge into forests and whole slopes vanish beneath cloud, the people later called the Chachapoya build settlements on summits, bury their dead in cliffs, and create communities in places that seem determined to reject permanent human life. Their cities do not sit beside broad rivers or on open plains. They cling to ridges. They rise above jungle canopies where rain loosens soil and fog erases distance. The landscape seems to resist permanence, yet stone walls remain. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The territory associated with the Chachapoya lies in what is now northern Peru, mainly across the rugged eastern slopes of the Andes. On a map, it can look like a narrow transition between the high Andes and the Amazon basin. On the ground, there is nothing simple about it. Mountains overlap in green chains, rivers carve deep ravines, rainstorms form quickly, forests change with altitude. From warmer valleys to cool cloud forest where moss coats branches and bromeliads hold water above the ground. A settlement on one ridge may face another only a few kilometers away, yet reaching it can require a long descent and an exhausting climb through mud and tangled growth. This geography shapes almost everything that follows. It helps explain why political control is difficult and why later conquerors struggle to keep the region quiet. Archaeology remains incomplete as well. Dense vegetation hides walls, landslides disturb deposits. Remote sites may be known to local farmers for generations before archaeologists document them. What survives in the record suggests a populous and organized landscape, but its full scale is still being reconstructed. For the people living here, survival depends on understanding vertical geography. Altitude changes temperature, rainfall, vegetation, and the crops that can be grown. Paths become lifelines. People learn which slopes hold firm during rain and which passes disappear into fog. A mountain that looks inaccessible from below may contain a route known to generations. A settlement that seems isolated today may once have stood within a web of trails, farms, lookout points, and neighboring communities. Food production demands adaptation rather than surrender. Maize grows in suitable zones. Tubers and other Andean crops support communities higher up. Forest resources add variety. People clear land, manage water, and modify slopes to create usable ground. Yet every decision is made against gravity. Stone and timber must be moved uphill. Heavy rainfall must be drained. Foundations must survive ground that naturally wants to shift. A blocked channel can become dangerous when a storm sends water across a settlement. This is why the first impression of the Chachapoya world is not simply mystery but effort. Every substantial building represents labor performed on difficult terrain. Every wall implies stone gathered, carried, and fitted. Every high settlement suggests repeated journeys with food, tools, fuel, and construction material. The romantic image of cities floating in clouds can hide the physical reality. These were human environments dependent on constant work. Paths eroded, roofs failed, drainage channels clogged, the forest always pressed close. And still, people chose these places. That choice becomes more striking when the fog lifts. From some Chachapoya sites, the view opens suddenly across immense valleys, with mountain walls fading blue-grey into the distance. Rivers become thin lines far below. Clouds move beneath the ridges so that settlements briefly appear suspended above a white sea. The view also reveals practical advantages. From high ground, communities can watch routes through the landscape. Defensive concerns almost certainly influence some locations, though no single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. Prestige may matter, sacred associations with mountains may matter, political competition may matter. The evidence remains incomplete. By roughly the first millennium AD, communities across this region are developing architectural traditions later associated with Chachapoya culture, and over the centuries that follow, settlements grow in number and complexity. The process is not a single moment of foundation. No known king suddenly gathers a people and orders a mountain civilization into existence. Instead, what survives suggests a long regional development in which communities adapt local building methods, strengthen connections, and create increasingly distinctive traditions. Circular stone buildings become one of the most recognizable features of the region. Walls rise from carefully prepared foundations. In some places, geometric designs decorate exterior stonework. Settlements occupy ridges, slopes, and mountain tops, forcing builders to work with the shape of the land. The dead are placed in cliffs and remote locations that turn mountainsides into ancestral landscapes. These practices do not prove that every community belongs to one united political state. Scholars still debate how tightly the region was organized, but the repetition of certain forms across a wide area shows that ideas, skills, and customs travel through the mountains. The Chachapoya world is therefore not an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered by the Inca centuries later. It is already inhabited, engineered, and socially organized. Families live in stone-founded houses. Farmers maintain plots across changing elevations. Builders understand drainage and slope stability well enough to create large settlements. Community authorities can organize labor on a significant scale, while wider Andean networks touch the region without erasing local traditions. Centuries later, outsiders will describe these mountains as a difficult frontier. Armies will climb into them. Chroniclers will record stories of rebellion. Modern explorers will stand before monumental walls and search for simple labels: fortress, kingdom, warrior culture. The mountains resist those labels as stubbornly as they resist roads. The evidence points instead to a complicated human landscape shaped by altitude, rain, movement, and generations of adaptation. The story begins, then, not with a vanished people, but with a crowded world hidden by its own geography. Beneath the cloud forest are house foundations, walls, terraces, tombs, and forgotten roots. Across ridges that now seem silent, communities once watched one another, traded, competed, married, fought, buried their dead, and built upward. The clouds did not separate them from history. They helped create the conditions in which a distinct world could rise, stone by stone, above the jungle. The name by which this civilization is now known does not come from the people themselves. No surviving Chachapoya chronicle explains who they believed they were, how they named their homeland. or whether inhabitants scattered across hundreds of mountain settlements considered themselves members of a single political community. The word Chachapoya reaches the historical record through outsiders, especially the Inca and the Spanish writers who later try to describe the populations living along the eastern Andean slopes. By then, the region has already endured conquest, rebellion, forced movement, epidemic disease, and social upheaval. The voices that dominate the written record belong largely to those who arrived after the Chachapoya world had begun to break apart. This creates a problem that follows the story at every stage. The famous image of the cloud warriors comes mostly from descriptions filtered through conflict. Inca authorities encounter the region as an imperial problem. Spanish chroniclers learn about it through interpreters, colonial officials, soldiers, priests, and indigenous informants living through enormous political change. Statements about physical appearance, fighting ability, loyalty, and customs are copied, repeated, and sometimes exaggerated. What begins as a limited observation can become a permanent label. Over centuries, the label hardens until it seems older and more certain than the evidence behind it. Even the popular expression cloud warriors is more modern and romantic than it first appears. It fits the landscape beautifully. Many settlements stand among cloud forests and high ridges, and warfare clearly forms part of Chachapoya history. Yet there is no evidence that every person in the region belonged to a single society of professional mountain fighters, farmers, builders, craft workers, religious specialists, local leaders, and families make up these communities. The dramatic title survives because it captures something real about geography and resistance while simplifying almost everything else. The written sources describe the people encountered by the Inca as difficult to control. They rebel more than once. Imperial forces must return to the region, and populations are eventually relocated through the Inca system of forced resettlement known as mitma. These events encourage an image of stubborn warriors defending remote strongholds. But resistance alone cannot define a culture that developed across centuries. A society capable of creating extensive settlements and complex funerary traditions requires far more than military skill. Its people must maintain food supplies, organize construction, negotiate relationships between communities, manage local resources, and pass specialized knowledge from one generation to another. The difficulty is that archaeology preserves these activities unevenly. Stone survives better than speech. Tombs can survive where stories disappear. A decorated wall may remain visible after the meanings attached to its patterns are lost. Human remains can reveal aspects of diet, health, injury, and migration, but they cannot easily tell archaeologists what political name a person used or which myths they heard as children. The evidence remains incomplete, and every reconstruction depends on combining physical traces with written accounts produced under very different conditions. What survives in the record suggests that the Chachapoya may have included numerous local groups sharing certain cultural traditions without necessarily forming one centralized nation. Settlements vary in size and design. Regional differences appear in architecture and burial customs. Mountains and deep river valleys naturally divide communities, even when paths connect them. A political leader powerful on one ridge may have little direct authority over communities several valleys away. Alliances could shift, families could move. Shared religious ideas and building traditions might travel farther than political control. This possibility changes how the landscape is interpreted. Instead of imagining one hidden kingdom with a capital directing every settlement, archaeologists must consider a network of related societies. These communities may have recognized common customs while competing fiercely with one another. The same architectural language could appear across the region without requiring a single ruler. Similar circular houses, decorative stone patterns, and burial traditions may reflect a broad cultural identity layered over strong local loyalties. There are hints that outsiders themselves understood the region as internally divided. Later accounts sometimes refer to provinces, local leaders, and distinct communities rather than one unified political structure. Unfortunately, colonial descriptions often impose administrative categories that did not exist in the same form before conquest. Spanish officials needed populations to fit into districts, tribute systems, and settlements they could govern. Their documents can preserve valuable names while also distorting older relationships. Scholars still debate how closely later colonial divisions reflect the political geography of the centuries before the Inca arrived. The absence of Chachapoya writing adds another layer of silence. No known local script records royal lists, wars, harvests, or religious traditions. Knowledge passes orally, as it does in much of the ancient Andes. This does not imply a lack of complexity. The Inca themselves rule an enormous empire without using alphabetic writing, relying on oral specialists and systems such as the quipu for administrative information. In the Chachapoya region, however, the disruptions of conquest and disease prove devastating to oral memory. When communities are dispersed and populations collapse, the people responsible for preserving genealogies and local traditions can disappear before their knowledge is recorded. That silence leaves space for legends. Early European descriptions of some Chachapoya people as relatively light-skinned or physically distinctive later inspire claims that the population descended from Vikings, Celts, Phoenicians, or other travellers from across the Atlantic. Such theories become popular because they offer a dramatic answer to the mystery of identity. Archaeological and genetic evidence does not support these foreign origin stories. The Chachapoya belong within the long history of indigenous South American populations, shaped by regional movement and interaction within the Andes and surrounding areas. The disputed legends reveal more about later fascination with the civilization than about its actual origins. The real mystery is subtler and, in many ways, more difficult. It is the mystery of how a broad cultural world forms across such fragmented terrain without leaving a written account of itself. Shared ideas clearly travel. Builders repeat certain forms. Funerary practices appear across large distances. Communities participate in patterns recognizable enough that archaeologists can speak meaningfully of a Chachapoya cultural tradition. Yet the exact mechanisms remain uncertain. Marriage networks may connect valleys. Seasonal gatherings may bring dispersed groups together. Trade routes may carry both objects and beliefs. Religious centers or powerful settlements may influence neighbors without directly ruling them. Even the physical movement of people is more complicated than the old image of an isolated mountain population. The eastern Andes are difficult to cross, but they are not sealed. Routes lead west toward the highlands and east toward warmer forests. Goods and ideas move between ecological zones. Feathers, plants, food products, stone, textiles, and ritual practices can travel through networks extending far beyond one settlement. The mountains create separation, but they also create corridors known intimately to the people who live there. To the Inca, however, these differences may have mattered less than the challenge of conquest. An expanding empire often turns diverse opponents into a single category. The name Chachapoya becomes useful because it identifies a troublesome region and the populations associated with it. Spanish writers inherit the term, preserve it, and pass it into modern history. Archaeologists continue using it because a shared label is necessary for discussing the related traditions found across northern Peru. But behind the name are thousands of individual lives whose own identities were probably more precise. A person might belong first to a household, an ancestral group, a settlement, or a particular valley. They may recognize people on distant ridges as culturally familiar while still viewing them as political rivals. They may share burial customs with communities they occasionally fight. Their world does not need to fit the clean borders modern maps prefer. The Cloud Warriors then emerge through a mixture of evidence and inheritance. Their reputation is sharpened by enemies, preserved by conquerors, and enlarged by later imagination. Yet beneath that reputation is something more difficult to reconstruct: a mountain society speaking largely through stone, bones, paths, and abandoned houses. To understand who these people were, the ruins themselves must carry more of the story, and across the ridges, those ruins begin appearing in astonishing numbers, entire settlements built where the forest and clouds seem almost capable of swallowing them whole. Across the eastern Andes, the ruins do not appear as isolated monuments. They spread across ridges, saddles, slopes, and mountain tops, sometimes hidden beneath forests so dense that trees grow directly from collapsed walls. Circular stone foundations cluster together in groups large enough to suggest permanent communities rather than temporary refuges. Narrow paths connect neighborhoods. Retaining walls hold sections of ground in place. In some settlements, structures press tightly against one another, while elsewhere houses are scattered along terraces shaped by the contours of the mountain. The pattern changes from valley to valley. Yet one fact becomes increasingly difficult to ignore: this was not a thinly inhabited frontier. The high country above the jungle once supported a substantial human population. Modern visitors often describe Chachapoya settlements as remote, but remoteness is a modern judgment shaped by roads, vehicles, and political centers located far away. For the people who built here, the mountains formed home territory. A ridge was not an obstacle if a trail crossed it. A valley was not empty if fields, springs, and neighboring households lay along its slopes. The landscape was measured through walking, memory, and inherited knowledge. Children would have learned where paths divided, where rain turned ground dangerous, where a stream could still be found in the dry season, and which distant hill belonged to another community. Settlements often occupy naturally defensible positions. Steep slopes reduce the number of easy approaches, while high viewpoints allow residents to observe movement through surrounding valleys. This has encouraged the idea that many Chachapoya communities were built primarily as fortresses. Warfare almost certainly influenced settlement choices in some places, especially during periods of regional competition and later imperial pressure. Yet defense cannot explain everything. People still need water, farmland, building material, and access to routes connecting different ecological zones. Some exposed ridge locations are difficult to supply over long periods, suggesting that social status, sacred geography, or control of movement may also have shaped where communities chose to build. No single explanation fully accounts for the diversity. What stands out immediately is the architecture. Round houses dominate many Chachapoya sites, a striking contrast with the rectangular building traditions more commonly associated with the Inca. The circular structures vary in size and complexity, but many stand on stone platforms that raise the interior above wet ground. Their lower walls are built from carefully laid stone, while roofs were probably constructed from perishable materials supported by timber. Those roofs are long gone, leaving rings of masonry open to rain and vegetation. Still, enough survives to reveal an architectural style repeated across a wide region. Some buildings display decorative stone friezes set into exterior walls. Diamond shapes and zigzag designs appear in carefully arranged bands, creating patterns visible from outside the structure. Their exact meaning is uncertain. Popular interpretations often connect them with serpents, feline skins, or other symbolic forms, but scholars still debate what these designs represented to the people who made them. They may have marked identity, status, ancestry, or local tradition. Perhaps several meanings overlapped. Whatever the case, decoration required extra labour, and its placement on visible surfaces suggests that architecture communicated something to those moving through the settlement. Building on a mountain ridge demands more than stacking stone. Ground must first be prepared. Slopes need to be stabilized. In places where natural surfaces are uneven, builders create platforms large enough to support houses. Retaining walls prevent soil from sliding downhill. Drainage becomes essential because cloud forest rainfall can saturate the ground quickly. Water moving uncontrolled through a settlement can erode foundations or trigger small collapses that grow more serious over time. The surprising detail is how much hidden engineering lies beneath the visible walls. Archaeologists examining Chachapoya sites often find that builders paid close attention to water movement. Stone fill, prepared surfaces, and channels help keep structures from becoming waterlogged. These systems are easy to overlook when visiting ruins because the dramatic walls attract the eye. Yet a settlement may survive for centuries only if its builders understand what happens during weeks of heavy rain. Monumental architecture in this environment is as much about drainage as appearance. The houses themselves suggest dense social life. A circular building is not simply a shell. Inside, low stone features may have supported sleeping areas or storage. Hearths provide evidence of food preparation and warmth. Grinding tools point to daily processing of crops. Animal remains, plant traces, pottery fragments, and worn floors reveal repeated routines performed by generations. Smoke would have gathered beneath roofs. Food dried or stored near walls. Tools were repaired. Children moved between household spaces. Dogs may have followed scraps and voices through narrow passages. In larger settlements, hundreds of circular structures create the impression of a crowded built environment. Not every building was necessarily occupied at the same moment, and population estimates remain uncertain, but the scale still matters. These communities required steady food production and organized access to resources. Wood had to be gathered, roof material replaced, paths maintained, fields cultivated beyond the residential core, waste removed or managed. The romantic silence of the ruins hides a constant rhythm of labor. Connections between settlements may have been equally important. Roads and mountain trails linked communities, though many ancient routes have eroded or been absorbed into later paths. Some tracks follow ridgelines, while others descend sharply toward rivers before climbing again. Movement through this territory required endurance, but it also allowed access to multiple environments. Lower valleys offered different crops and forest products than higher elevations. A household or community with connections across altitude zones could reduce risk and obtain goods unavailable near its own settlement. This vertical movement is a familiar feature of Andean societies, where ecological diversity is compressed into relatively short horizontal distances. In the Chachapoya region, however, the topography intensifies the challenge. A journey visible across one valley may still demand hours of descent and climbing. Loads must be carried by people and, in later periods, by camelids where conditions permit. Rain can damage roots. Fallen trees block forest paths. River crossings change after storms. Even so, architectural similarities show that communities were not sealed apart. Building knowledge travelled, decorative styles spread, burial traditions developed broad regional patterns. Ideas moved along the same paths as food, marriage partners, ritual specialists, and political messengers. A mason visiting another settlement could observe a new construction technique. A family joining another community could bring household traditions with them, over generations. These small movements help create the shared cultural world now called Chachapoya. At the same time, local identity remains visible. Some settlements emphasize particular decorative forms, others differ in layout or construction detail. The region does not appear to have been built from one central plan. There is no clear evidence of an empire sending standardized architects to every valley. What survives instead suggests communities participating in common traditions while adapting them to local terrain and social needs. The scale of occupation raises another question. Why invest so much effort in high settlements when lower areas might seem easier? Security is one possibility. Access to particular farmland and climate zones is another. Disease environments may also have varied by altitude. Social and ritual meanings attached to mountains could have made elevated places desirable. Control over routes may have strengthened powerful communities. The evidence remains incomplete. And the answer probably changed from one settlement to another. What is clear is that these cities above the jungle were not accidental. They were chosen, built, repaired, and inhabited through generations. People transformed ridges into neighborhoods and turned steep ground into living space. Stone foundations multiplied until mountainsides carried dense clusters of homes. From a distance, the settlements may have appeared to merge with the cliffs. From inside them, the world was filled with paths, smoke, cultivated slopes, neighbors, and the daily noise of a population fully adapted to its vertical homeland. Among all these high settlements, one site eventually comes to dominate modern imagination. Its walls rise with a scale unmatched by ordinary villages, enclosing hundreds of structures on a long mountain ridge. Later visitors will call it a fortress, a city, even a Chachapoya capital. None of those labels fits perfectly. Behind its immense outer wall, Quelap waits in the mist. Quelap does not reveal itself all at once. The approach climbs through green slopes where clouds drift across the trail and moisture hangs on every surface. Then the wall appears, not as a low boundary but as a massive stone face rising above the ridge. In places it stands close to 20 meters high, built from countless blocks fitted into a long, artificial platform that reshapes the mountaintop itself. Trees now grow from the upper levels. Roots twist through masonry. Moss softens edges that were once sharp, yet even in ruin, the scale is difficult to dismiss. Someone decided that this ridge needed to carry far more stone than any ordinary settlement required. The site sits in the northern Peruvian Andes at roughly 3,000 meters above sea level, overlooking deep valleys and cloud forest. Its location immediately encourages military interpretations: high ground, restricted access, commanding views, massive walls. Everything seems to suggest a fortress. Early descriptions often treated Quelap in exactly that way, presenting it as a stronghold of the Cloud Warriors. The image is powerful and not entirely unreasonable, but the closer archaeologists look, the more complicated the site becomes. The outer wall does not simply surround a natural summit. Much of the interior rests on a huge constructed platform filled with stone and earth. Builders effectively enlarge and level the ridge, creating a long, elevated space where hundreds of structures can stand. This requires a remarkable investment of labor. Stone must be quarried or collected, carried, shaped, and placed. Fill material has to be moved. Drainage must be considered. Because a giant artificial platform on a rain-soaked mountain can become unstable if water gathers inside it. The engineering problem is enormous, and the survival of so much of the complex suggests that the builders understood the mountain beneath their feet. There are more than 400 structures within the main monumental area, most of them circular, some are modest, others are larger and more elaborate, with decorated walls and internal features. Narrow pathways move between buildings. Different sectors appear to have served different functions. The site was not merely a wall enclosing empty ground for soldiers. People lived, worked, prepared food, and buried their dead here. Evidence of domestic activity complicates any attempt to reduce Kuelap to a simple military post. The entrances are among the most dramatic features. Rather than broad gateways designed for easy movement, access points narrow as they pass through the massive walls. One famous entrance begins wide enough to seem welcoming, then tightens into a confined passage where movement becomes increasingly restricted. At its narrowest, only a small number of people can pass side by side. From a defensive perspective, the advantage is obvious. Attackers forced into such a passage would lose the power of numbers, yet entrances can also control ceremonial movement and regulate who enters important spaces. Scholars still debate how strongly military needs shape the design. Inside, certain buildings stand apart from ordinary houses. One structure, often called El Tintero because later observers thought its shape resembled an inkwell, has an unusual inverted cone-like form. Its walls narrow toward the base rather than widening, giving it a distinctive appearance. Archaeologists have proposed ritual or astronomical functions, though the evidence remains incomplete. Drainage features and internal construction details show careful planning, but no surviving inscription explains what ceremonies, observations, or activities took place there. Another prominent structure, known as the Torion, occupies a strategic point and has often been interpreted as defensive. Its position and form make that possibility plausible. Still, architecture can serve several purposes across centuries. A building created for surveillance may later gain ceremonial importance. A sacred place can become militarized during conflict. Kuelap was occupied and modified over a long period. And treating every wall as if it belonged to one single plan risks flattening generations of change into a single moment. This is one of the most surprising aspects of the site. Kuelap is not simply built, used, and abandoned in a neat sequence. Construction appears to develop through phases. Buildings are repaired, replaced, or modified. Burials occur within the settlement. New structures rise near older ones. The site changes as communities change. What visitors see today is a compressed landscape of different periods. The remains of many decisions made by people who did not necessarily understand Kuelap in exactly the same way as their ancestors. The monumental platform itself may have carried political meaning beyond practical construction. Raising a settlement above the ridge creates visibility. It transforms the mountain silhouette. From surrounding valleys, Kuelap would have signaled the presence of an organized community capable of mobilizing enormous labor. In societies without written public monuments, architecture can become a statement of power. The wall does not need an inscription if everyone who sees it already understands how difficult it was to build. But power is rarely a simple matter. Was Kuelap the capital of a united Chachapoya kingdom? The idea remains popular, yet archaeological evidence has not produced a clear royal palace, centralized archive, or unambiguous signs of one ruling dynasty controlling the entire region. The broader Chachapoya landscape appears politically fragmented. Kuelap may have been a major regional center, without governing every community associated with Chachapoya culture. It could have combined political, religious, residential, and defensive roles. Human remains found at the site add darker layers to the story. Some individuals show evidence of violence. Certain deposits suggest episodes of conflict or social disruption. At least one mass burial has been interpreted as the result of violent events, though the precise historical circumstances remain debated. Were these deaths connected to local rivalry, Inca expansion, rebellion, or later upheaval? The record does not provide a single clean answer. No single explanation fully accounts for every sign of trauma. The presence of violence matters because Kuelap stands in a region where political tensions eventually intensify. Before the Inca arrive, local communities may already compete for land, roots, prestige, and labor. Monumental centers can become symbols worth defending. A powerful settlement attracts allies, traders, pilgrims, and rivals. The same walls that express strength may also reveal an expectation of danger. Yet daily life continues inside those walls. Fires burn in houses, grain and tubers are processed, roofs must be replaced after heavy weather. Water moves through drains. Children grow up among the circular buildings and narrow passages. The site is not permanently frozen in preparation for war. Its residents spend far more time maintaining households than facing armies. Archaeology often recovers the remains of ordinary routines beside signs of extraordinary events, and Quelap is no exception. Decoration adds another dimension. Geometric stone friezes appear on several structures, including patterns of diamonds and zigzags carefully worked into exterior walls. These designs may have signaled lineage, community affiliation, status, or religious ideas. Some modern interpretations link the diamond forms to feline eyes or the zigzags to serpents, but such identifications remain uncertain. What is clear is that the builders invested effort in making parts of the settlement visually distinctive. Quelap was meant to be experienced, not merely occupied. Imagine approaching before the forest reclaimed the ridge. The monumental wall rises cleanly above the slopes. Roofed circular buildings fill the interior. Smoke drifts upward. People move through controlled entrances carrying food, textiles, tools, and ritual objects. Voices echo against stone. The view opens toward distant mountain chains. Clouds move through the valleys below, sometimes swallowing the lower world entirely. In those moments, Quelap may have seemed less like a city built on a mountain than a city separated from the earth beneath it. That atmosphere helps explain why later generations turn the site into a symbol. It fits the legend of a lost mountain people almost too perfectly. But the real Quelap is more interesting than the legend because it refuses one easy identity. It is fortified but inhabited, monumental but filled with households, regionally powerful yet not clearly the capital of a single kingdom. Its walls announce organization, while its internal complexity reveals centuries of change. To understand the people who made such a place, however, the scale must shrink again. Behind the monumental wall, history survives not only in grand architecture but in hearths, storage spaces, worn floors, grinding stones, broken pottery, and the remains of meals. The city becomes clearer when attention returns to the circular houses, where the cloud warriors stop being a name given by enemies and become families living ordinary lives in an extraordinary landscape. Inside the circular houses, the mystery becomes smaller and more human. Monumental walls disappear from view behind neighbouring roofs. The dramatic cliffs and distant valleys are no longer the centre of attention. Life is measured instead by smoke, stored food, damp clothing, cracked pottery, and the condition of the roof after another season of rain. A household wakes inside a stone structure whose circular wall may have stood for generations. The floor has been walked smooth. A hearth occupies part of the interior. Raised stone features create separate working or resting spaces. Tools lie where they can be reached easily. Outside, paths curve between buildings because straight lines make little sense in a settlement shaped by round houses and uneven ground. The surviving lower walls tell only part of the story. Chachapoya houses originally rise higher with timber and perishable materials supporting steep roofs designed to shed heavy rainfall. Thatch must be renewed regularly. Smoke from domestic fires probably darkens interior surfaces and helps dry parts of the roof, though constant moisture remains a problem. In a cloud forest environment, almost everything organic is vulnerable to decay. Wood rots, stored food spoils, Cloth holds dampness. A household survives by managing these small threats before they become serious. The circular plan creates a compact interior. In some buildings, archaeologists have identified low platforms or bench-like stone features that may have supported sleeping areas, storage, or household activities. Their exact uses are not always clear because later occupation and collapse disturb original arrangements. Grinding stones and food processing tools point to daily preparation of crops. Pottery fragments reveal vessels used for cooking, serving, and storage. Animal bones and botanical remains, where preservation allows, offer glimpses of meals that never appear in written history. Maize is important in many Chachapoya communities, but it's not the only food sustaining the high settlements. Tubers and other Andean crops provide dependable calories across different elevations. Beans, squash, and locally available plants add variety. In lower and warmer zones, farmers can access products impossible to grow near the highest settlements. The Chachapoya landscape encourages movement between ecological levels, and household food may reflect connections extending from cool ridges to humid valleys. Maize also carries importance beyond simple nutrition. Across the ancient Andes, it can be processed into chicha, a fermented drink closely linked with hospitality, ritual, and political gathering. Chachapoya-specific practices remain harder to reconstruct in detail, but containers, food processing evidence, and broader Andean traditions suggest that communal drinking likely played some role in social life. A gathering around food and fermented drink can settle alliances, honor ancestors, strengthen family ties, or display a household's ability to provide for others. In societies where authority depends partly on relationships, generosity can be political. The household is therefore more than a private shelter. It is a place where economic and social life overlap. Food is stored and transformed there. Children learn tasks by watching adults. Objects are repaired. Visitors may be received. Ritual acts connected with family and ancestry may take place close to everyday activities. The division modern societies often make between domestic, sacred, and political space does not always fit ancient communities. A house can carry memories of previous generations while remaining filled with the routine mess of living. One lesser-known feature of Chachapoya settlements is the presence of burials in or near inhabited spaces at some sites. Human remains are not always separated into distant cemeteries. The dead can remain physically close to the living, beneath floors, inside architectural features, or within settlement boundaries. Practices vary across time and place, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the pattern suggests that household history may be tied to ancestral presence in ways difficult to recover fully. A building could represent not only current residents, but a line of people associated with that place. This connection may help explain why rebuilding matters. When a structure deteriorates, people do not always abandon it and begin elsewhere. Walls are repaired, floors are resurfaced. New construction incorporates older foundations. A house can accumulate history. One generation changes a space created by another. Archaeologists later find layers of occupation compressed together. Small material traces marking meals, fires, repairs, and abandonment. Clothing rarely survives in ordinary houses because moisture destroys textiles. But the region's better preserved funerary context demonstrates sophisticated weaving traditions. Chachapoya people wear textiles produced from fibers available through Andean networks, and clothing likely communicates status, community ties, and identity. Spinning and weaving demand time and specialized skill, even when cloth disappears from house floors. Tools connected to textile production remind archaeologists of labor performed daily, much of it probably by women. Pottery offers another window into identity. Chachapoya ceramics are often described as less technically elaborate than some famous coastal Peruvian traditions, but such comparisons can mislead. A cooking vessel is designed to survive repeated heating, carrying, and cleaning, rather than impress a modern museum visitor. Local pottery traditions vary, and imported or externally influenced styles reveal contact with other regions. A broken pot found in a household may record trade, migration, or changing political relationships as clearly as a monumental wall. The same is true of food. Stable isotope studies and analysis of human remains can reveal broad dietary patterns, though results vary between communities and individuals. Some people consume different proportions of maize or other resources, possibly reflecting status, origin, or access to particular ecological zones. Evidence of childhood diet may differ from adult patterns, suggesting movement during a person's life. Scholars still debate the scale of migration within the Chachapoya region, but human bodies themselves sometimes preserve the chemical traces of changing landscapes. Health presents a mixed picture. Mountain life demands physical endurance. Skeletal remains can show degenerative changes associated with repeated labour, heavy loads, and long movement across steep terrain. Dental wear and disease reveal the consequences of diet. Injuries sometimes heal, demonstrating that individuals survived serious trauma and were supported during recovery. Other remains show violence that may have proved fatal. The skeleton records both the normal strain of work and the more sudden damage of conflict. Children are present in the archaeological record as well. Though ancient narratives often allow them to disappear behind warriors and rulers, they would have formed a large part of any settlement population. Their lives unfold among dangerous slopes, open fires, tools, animals, and constant work. Childhood probably includes early participation in household tasks. Water must be carried, food must be processed, younger siblings watched, plants gathered. Skills are learned gradually. Not in formal schools, but through repetition and correction. Dogs likely share these settlements with people. Canines have a long history in the Andes, serving practical and social roles. Their remains appear in archaeological contexts across pre-Columbian Peru. In Chachapoya communities, dogs may assist in hunting, guard houses, consume waste, and simply live as familiar household animals. The exact relationship varies, but their presence adds another layer to the crowded reality of these mountain towns. At night, temperatures fall. The cloud forest outside becomes dark quickly, especially beneath heavy mist. Houses glow from hearthlight while narrow paths between them disappear into shadow. Sound travels strangely across ridges. A voice from a nearby structure may seem close. A distant animal call rises from the forest below. Rain against a steep roof can continue for hours. The monumental settlement that looks silent in ruin is, in life, full of small noises. There is little evidence that residents thought of themselves primarily as inhabitants of mysterious cities in the clouds. That language belongs to later observers. For them, the circular house is simply where grain is stored, where meals are shared, where a roof leaks, where an elderly relative sleeps, and where family memory attaches itself to stone. The extraordinary becomes ordinary through repetition. Yet ordinary life here depends on systems larger than any household. A family can repair one wall, but it cannot alone maintain every path, terrace, drain, and monumental platform. Dense settlements require cooperation. Water must be directed before it destroys foundations. Slopes must be stabilized. Agricultural land must remain productive. The success of the circular house ultimately depends on an entire landscape being engineered against rain and gravity. The survival of a Chachapoya settlement begins below the surface. A visitor standing among circular walls sees masonry, platforms, and terraces, but the most important work often lies where the eye does not immediately look, beneath floors, behind retaining walls, and along the edges of slopes are systems designed to persuade water to move in controlled ways. In this country, rain is not a passing inconvenience. It is a force capable of turning soil heavy, opening cracks, washing away paths, and pushing entire sections of mountain downhill. A city built above the jungle is always negotiating with gravity, and gravity is not known for compromise. The builders understand this because failure would have been immediate and visible. A poorly placed house might lean after repeated storms. A blocked drainage channel could send water beneath a wall. Saturated fill inside a platform might expand, shift, or collapse. The engineering challenge is especially severe at monumental sites such as Quaylap, where enormous quantities of stone and soil are gathered into artificial terraces and elevated platforms. The structures above depend on the stability of what lies beneath them. Chachapoya builders respond by preparing ground carefully. In many places, stone is used not merely for walls but to reinforce slopes and create stable foundations. Retaining walls hold earth in place, allowing people to establish level building surfaces where none naturally exist. Stone fill can improve drainage by allowing water to move through spaces rather than collecting in compacted soil. Channels carry runoff away from houses and public areas. The precise techniques vary across sites, and later damage makes some systems difficult to reconstruct. But what survives in the record suggests a sophisticated practical understanding of mountain water. This knowledge is not theoretical. It develops through generations of observation. People watch where rain gathers after a storm. They remember which wall failed in a particularly wet season. Builders learn that one kind of stone works better in foundations while another splits too easily. A construction method that survives is repeated. A failed design disappears or is modified. Over centuries, environmental knowledge becomes embedded in architecture. The high levels of rainfall also influence settlement layout. Paths need surfaces that remain usable when the ground is wet. Steep routes may require steps cut or constructed into slopes. Water crossing a residential area must be redirected before it turns a walkway into an erosion channel. Roofs need strong angles so rain runs off quickly, yet roof runoff itself creates another problem. Hundreds of buildings shedding water during the same storm can concentrate enormous volumes of flow within a dense settlement. A surprising difficulty lies in the success of the settlements themselves. The more people build, the more they alter natural drainage. A forested slope absorbs and slows rainfall through soil and vegetation. Replace part of that surface with roofs, compacted paths, platforms, and walls, and water begins moving differently. Builders must respond continually. Drainage is not a structure created once and forgotten. Channels clog with leaves and sediment. Walls develop cracks. Roots enter masonry. Maintenance becomes a collective responsibility. This may help explain why organized labor is so visible in the Chachapoya landscape, even when centralized political authority remains uncertain. A powerful king is not required for neighbors to understand that a collapsing retaining wall threatens everyone below it. Communities can mobilize labor through kinship, local leadership, ritual obligations, or reciprocal work traditions across the Andes. Collective labor becomes a fundamental way of accomplishing tasks too large for individual households. The exact Chachapoya institutions are not fully known, but dense mountain settlements could not function without repeated cooperation. Agriculture demands similar coordination. Flatland is rare, so farmers use slopes, natural benches, valley bottoms, and constructed terraces where conditions allow. Not every visible terrace in the broader region belongs to the same period or culture, and scholars still debate the dating and function of some systems. Even so, Chachapoya communities clearly modify land for cultivation and settlement. Terracing can reduce erosion, create more manageable planting surfaces, and influence soil moisture. It also requires labour to build and repair. Farmers must read altitude with remarkable precision. A small change in elevation can alter temperature and humidity. One crop may flourish on a slope where another performs badly. Frost risk increases higher up. Lower valleys may be warmer, but carry different pests and disease pressures. Instead of depending on one uniform agricultural zone, communities can use the vertical landscape to spread risk. Fields at different elevations may not fail at the same time or for the same reason. This strategy, however, requires movement. Food grown below must be carried upward. Tools and people travel between settlement and field. In places, Chachapoya residential centres stand some distance from the most productive agricultural land. The daily cost is measured in climbing. A person carrying maize or tubers uphill burns energy simply transporting the calories needed to sustain the settlement. Modern visitors walking these trails often feel the effort after a single climb. Ancient residents repeat it throughout their lives. Mountain paths therefore become part of the civilization's infrastructure. Some follow ridges, where travel may be easier and visibility better. Others descend into deep valleys to reach water crossings and neighbouring ecological zones. Routes connect households to farms and settlements to one another. They carry food, pottery, textiles, ritual objects, and information. A road does not need monumental paving to be important. Many essential routes may have looked like narrow trails worn deeper by generations of feet. The Chachapoya are sometimes described as isolated because their region appears difficult to modern outsiders. The engineering of movement tells a different story. People who live in steep country do not eliminate mountains, they learn how to navigate them efficiently. Distances are understood through travel time, slope, weather, and seasonal conditions. A pass hidden by fog can be familiar to someone who has crossed it since childhood. A forest path invisible to an invading army may be obvious to local residents. Bridges would have been crucial where rivers and ravines interrupted routes, although organic materials rarely survive. Across the Andes, suspension bridges and simpler constructions made from fibre, wood, and rope allow communities to cross difficult gaps. Direct evidence for particular Chachapoya bridges is limited, but the movement required by the settlement network implies repeated solutions to dangerous crossings. When a bridge fails, an entire route can change. Repair may demand labour from several communities. Water supply inside high settlements raises another practical question. Some sites have access to springs or nearby sources, while others require careful collection and movement of water. Rain is abundant, but abundance does not automatically mean reliability in a usable form. Drinking water must be accessible and reasonably clean. During dry periods, sources can shrink. During storms, runoff becomes muddy and contaminated. Settlement location may therefore reflect knowledge of springs and underground flows as much as defensive position. Quaylap offers a dramatic example of the dangers that appear when drainage systems deteriorate. Centuries after major occupation ends, blocked channels, vegetation growth, heavy rainfall, and the gradual movement of its immense platform contribute to structural instability. Sections of monumental walls have suffered collapse. Modern conservation teams confront the same fundamental enemy. The original builders faced water entering places where it should not remain. The difference is that ancient residents maintained the site as a living settlement. Once that constant labour stops, the mountain begins taking back control. That pattern repeats throughout the cloud forest. A path disappears under vegetation within years. A roofless building fills with organic debris. Tree roots separate stones slowly. Water follows new channels through collapsed walls. A settlement abandoned by people does not remain frozen. It becomes part of the slope again. The true achievement of Chachapoya engineering is therefore not that their buildings defeated nature. They never did. No mountain civilization can. Their achievement lies in maintaining an unstable balance for generations. They build where the ground is steep, the rain heavy, and the forest persistent, then create systems of stone, labor, and memory that keep communities alive. Yet engineering alone does not explain why certain mountains, cliffs, and summits matter so deeply. The same people who stabilize slopes for houses place their dead in places far more difficult to reach than any ordinary village. High on cliff faces, above valleys and forests, they create tombs that seem designed not for convenience but for visibility, separation, and permanence. The mountains are not only obstacles to be engineered, they are also landscapes of the ancestors. The dead rise above the valleys. From below, a cliff may look almost smooth, a grey wall broken only by patches of vegetation and dark cracks where birds disappear. Then the light changes, or a guide points toward a ledge, and shapes emerge from the rock. Small structures cling to the mountainside. Human figures stand in a row beneath an overhang. A tomb opening appears where no sensible person would choose to build anything. The effect is unsettling because these places seem deliberately removed from ordinary movement. Houses belong to ridges and settlements. Fields belong to slopes and valleys. The dead are placed somewhere else, above roads, above rivers, sometimes above the clouds themselves. Chachapoya funerary traditions are among the most distinctive in the ancient Andes, though they are far from uniform. Some communities use cliff tombs built into natural cavities. Others construct small mausoleums, often called chulpas, grouped together on ledges. In certain places, anthropomorphic sarcophagi contain individual burials, their painted faces looking outward from inaccessible rock. The variation matters because there was no single Chachapoya burial custom practiced unchanged across the entire region. Local traditions, chronology, status, and political connections all influence how the dead are treated. What survives in the record suggests a shared concern with placing ancestors in powerful landscape positions, but scholars still debate the exact beliefs behind that choice. Reaching many tombs is difficult even with modern equipment. Archaeologists sometimes use ropes, climbing gear, and carefully planned routes to approach ledges that ancient builders somehow accessed while carrying stone, clay, timber, textiles, and human remains. The physical effort immediately raises questions. Convenience clearly was not the main priority. A corpse could have been buried near a settlement with far less risk. Instead, communities invest time and danger in moving the dead into cliffs. Part of the answer may lie in preservation. Dry rock shelters can protect bodies and textiles from the relentless moisture of the cloud forest. Some tombs remain astonishingly intact because overhanging cliffs shield them from direct rain. Yet practical preservation alone does not fully explain the visibility and elaborate construction of many sites. These tombs appear positioned to face valleys, rivers, or inhabited landscapes. The dead may have been physically distant but symbolically present, watching over territories connected with their descendants. Ancestor veneration is a major feature of many Andean societies. The dead are not always understood as completely separated from the living. Important ancestors can remain socially active through memory, ritual, and the treatment of their bodies. Communities may visit tombs, make offerings, or invoke ancestral authority. The precise Chachapoya rituals are not fully preserved, but funerary architecture strongly suggests that the identity of the dead mattered to the living. A tomb placed in a visible cliff could transform a mountain into a permanent statement of belonging. This possibility gives burial location a political dimension. Land in a steep region is valuable, especially roots, productive slopes, and strategic ridges. A lineage that places generations of ancestors above a valley creates a visible connection between family and territory. The tomb becomes more than a container for bones. It becomes evidence of deep residence. The ancestors were here, and therefore their descendants belong here. No inscription is needed if everyone understands whose dead occupy the cliff. The bodies themselves are often prepared with extraordinary care. In some tombs, individuals are placed in tightly flexed positions and wrapped in layers of textiles. The knees are drawn toward the chest, creating compact mummy bundles. Additional materials may surround the body. In the right conditions, skin, hair, fingernails, and internal tissues can survive for centuries. Preservation varies dramatically, and many tombs have been disturbed. But certain discoveries provide unusually intimate views of Chachapoya death. Mummification in this context does not necessarily mean the kind of artificial embalming associated with ancient Egypt. Environmental conditions, body preparation, wrapping, and tomb design can work together to produce natural or partly intentional preservation. The distinction is important. Popular accounts sometimes describe every preserved Andean body as the result of a secret mummification process. In reality, methods differ widely. Chachapoya communities clearly prepared the dead deliberately, but the exact techniques and their variation remain incompletely understood. Textiles surrounding the bodies are especially valuable because ordinary clothing rarely survives in wet settlements. Funerary contexts preserve woven cloth that reveals skilled production, patterns, and connections with broader Andean traditions. Some tombs also contain pottery, gourds, tools, and objects associated with the deceased. The grave goods are rarely as overwhelmingly rich as the treasure-filled burials imagined in popular stories. Their importance lies in what they reveal about identity, ritual, and exchange. Human remains add a different type of evidence. Age, sex, disease, injury, and diet can often be studied from skeletons and preserved bodies. Some individuals show signs of healed fractures, others carry cranial trauma, suggesting interpersonal violence or warfare. Patterns of disease reveal the costs of labor and environment. Dental remains show wear and decay linked with food. Hair and tissue can sometimes preserve chemical traces of diet. The dead become biological records of lives otherwise absent from written history. One surprising feature found in parts of the Chachapoya region is evidence of cranial modification. In several ancient Andean cultures, infants' heads are deliberately shaped using bindings or boards while the skull is still developing. The result is a permanent change in head form that may communicate identity, status, or group affiliation. Chachapoya evidence varies, and not every individual shows modification, but where it appears, it suggests that social identity could be marked on the body from early childhood. Bodies and tombs also reveal movement after death. Some burial places contain remains that appear to have been reorganized or relocated. Bones may be gathered together. Mummy bundles may be placed in shared chambers. This suggests funerary rituals extending beyond a single burial event. The dead could be revisited. A tomb might function for generations, receiving new individuals and requiring older remains to be shifted. Death, in other words, was a process managed over time. The effort involved implies specialized knowledge. Someone must understand how to prepare a body, how to wrap it, where to place offerings, and how to enter dangerous cliffs safely. Ritual specialists may have supervised parts of the process, though the evidence remains incomplete. Climbers with experience of the terrain were probably essential. A funeral leading toward a cliff tomb would have required coordination, especially if a mummy bundle had to be lifted or carried along narrow ledges. These journeys must have carried powerful emotional weight. The body leaves the familiar circular house and moves through paths known during life. It passes fields and neighbouring settlements. Then the route turns toward rock, becoming steeper and more dangerous. Perhaps only a small group continues to the final tomb. The settlement remains below. Once placed within the cliff, the deceased occupies a position the living rarely visit casually. From that height, the relationship reverses. The dead are no longer beneath the living, hidden under earth. They are above them. This vertical placement may reflect broader Andean ideas in which mountains possess sacred power, and high places connect human communities with forces beyond ordinary life. Yet caution is necessary. Chachapoya beliefs cannot simply be reconstructed by borrowing religious concepts from later Inca sources and assuming they were identical. Cultural interactions certainly existed, but local traditions had their own histories. No single explanation fully accounts for every burial site. Still, the pattern is difficult to dismiss. Again and again, ancestors are placed in commanding landscapes. Their tombs face outward. Their bodies are preserved. Their resting places require effort to reach. The living invest extraordinary labour in keeping the dead close enough to remain part of the social world, yet distant enough to occupy a realm of their own. Centuries later, looters will climb these same cliffs searching for objects to sell. Archaeologists will enter damaged chambers and find mummy bundles cut open, bones scattered, textiles removed. Other tombs will survive only because they remain almost impossibly hidden. And at a handful of places, the cliffs preserve something even more haunting than enclosed chambers. Human-shaped sarcophagi stand upright against the rock, their faces turned toward the valley, watching a landscape their descendants once filled. At Chachapoya, the cliff seems almost empty until the figures are noticed. They stand high above the valley on a narrow ledge beneath a rock overhang, 6 human-shaped forms pressed against the stone as if they have been waiting there for centuries. Their bodies are tall and cylindrical, built from clay, stone, and organic material. Their heads rise above the rounded torsos. Painted faces look outward with simplified eyes and long noses. Some carry skulls placed above them, adding a grim detail that is easy to miss from a distance. The sarcophagi are known locally as Puran machos, and they have become some of the most recognizable remains associated with the Chachapoya. Yet their fame has not made their meaning completely clear. Each sarcophagus was designed to hold a human body, usually placed in a tightly flexed position and wrapped before being enclosed. The outer figure effectively turns the tomb into a monumental human shape. It is burial architecture and representation combined. Unlike a chamber hidden deep inside rock, the Chachapoya figures remain visible from across the valley. Their inaccessible location protects them, but their silhouettes announce their presence. Whoever placed them there did not intend the dead to disappear entirely. The individuals buried within such sarcophagi were probably people of importance, though the exact nature of that importance remains uncertain. Local leaders, respected lineage members, ritual specialists, or other high-status individuals are possibilities. The expense and danger involved make it unlikely that every resident received the same treatment. Builders first had to reach the ledge, prepare the burial, construct the figure around it, and complete the work without allowing materials or people to fall hundreds of meters. The method used to reach some sites is still debated. Temporary scaffolding, ropes, ladders, or access from above may have been involved. But much of that equipment was made from perishable material and has vanished. The tall figures at Chachapoya may therefore represent more than individual dead. They may have embodied authority. A row of ancestral forms overlooking a valley could communicate the continuing presence of powerful families. Their painted faces are not realistic portraits in the modern sense, but differences in head form and decoration may have carried meaning to people familiar with the tradition. The evidence remains incomplete. and it is impossible to know whether local residents recognize specific individuals simply by seeing the sarcophagi. Above some Puran machos are human skulls. These have encouraged dramatic interpretations involving trophy heads and warfare. Violence is certainly part of Chachapoya history, and head-taking appears in several ancient South American contexts. Yet the exact significance of the skulls at Karagia remains uncertain. They may represent enemies, ancestors, ritual objects, or later modifications. Scholars still debate the details, and no single explanation fully accounts for every funerary arrangement across the region. Karagia is only one expression of a much larger mortuary landscape. Elsewhere, Chachapoya tombs form rows of small buildings built directly into cliffs. Sites such as Rivash contain mausoleums whose painted facades resemble miniature settlements. Rectangular structures stand beneath overhangs, their walls decorated with red designs. From a distance, they can look almost like tiny houses suspended above the valley. The architecture creates an unsettling reflection of the world below, as though the dead inhabit their own settlement in stone. Painted motifs at funerary sites include geometric patterns, human-like forms, and other designs whose meanings are difficult to reconstruct. Some may relate to lineage, status, or ritual beliefs. Others might have been added during separate phases of use. Moisture, looting, and weathering have erased much of the original decoration. What survives in the record suggests that colour and visual symbols were important parts of funerary architecture, not accidental additions. The most extraordinary evidence, however, comes from a place hidden beside a remote high-altitude lake. Laguna de los Condores lies in a landscape of steep slopes, forest, and water, far from the routes most modern travellers use. In the 1990s, local people discovered tombs built beneath cliffs overlooking the lake. Looters reached the chambers quickly, disturbing mummy bundles and removing objects before authorities and archaeologists could fully protect the site. Even after this damage, the discovery proved astonishing. Hundreds of mummies and funerary objects survived. The number of preserved individuals changes the scale of investigation. A single mummy can reveal one life. A large collection begins to reveal patterns across a community. Researchers can compare age, disease, diet, injuries, and body preparation. Textiles preserve information about weaving and cultural connections. Funerary bundles show repeated methods of wrapping. Objects found in association with the dead reflect ritual behavior and social change. Laguna de los Condores also reveals a major complication. Many of the burials date to the period of Inca influence or control. The tombs contain evidence of interaction between Chachapoya traditions and imperial Inca practices. This means the mummies cannot simply be treated as a frozen example of an untouched local culture. By the time many individuals are buried there, the region has already entered a period of political pressure and cultural transformation. Some bodies appear to have been treated using methods associated with broader Andean traditions. While local funerary customs continue, textiles and artifacts show mixtures of styles. This is precisely the kind of archaeological evidence that resists clean cultural labels. A person buried in Chachapoya territory under Inca rule may have local ancestry, imperial connections, mixed family relationships, and a life shaped by forced political changes. Identity does not stop at the border of an archaeological category. The preservation at the lake is remarkably intimate. Mummified faces retain skin stretched across bone. Hair remains. Hands and feet survive inside bundles. In certain cases, tattoos or other bodily details may be visible. These are not idealized stone figures but physical people. Some suffered infections. Some endured injuries. Children died young. Adults show the repeated strain of daily work. A few bodies preserve wounds that may indicate violence. One of the strange details found during mummy studies is evidence that some individuals suffered significant trauma, yet survived long enough for bones to heal. A fractured limb or damaged skull does not automatically mean immediate death. Healing shows that injured people continued living, sometimes for years. They must have been fed and supported while recovering. Behind the reputation for warfare is evidence of care. The quiet social labour required to keep a wounded member of a household alive. Other injuries appear more violent and less forgiving. Cranial trauma occurs in several Chachapoya skeletal populations. Some wounds may result from accidents in steep terrain, but repeated patterns suggest interpersonal conflict also played a role. Distinguishing warfare from local violence is difficult. A blow to the skull does not record the name of the attacker or the reason for the strike. Archaeologists can identify trauma more confidently than they can reconstruct the event that caused it. The mummies also preserve evidence of deliberate funerary handling. Bodies are flexed, wrapped, and positioned carefully. Some bundles may have been moved after initial preparation. Tomb chambers contain remains from multiple individuals, indicating repeated use. The dead accumulate over time. Older bundles are shifted to make space. Funerary objects are rearranged. The tomb becomes an active place rather than a sealed chamber closed forever after one burial. This repeated contact suggests that descendants or ritual specialists return to the dead. Exactly what happened during these visits is unknown. Offerings may have been added. Bodies may have been inspected or repositioned. Ceremonies could have renewed relationships between living families and ancestors. Later, Inca influence may have changed these practices. The evidence remains incomplete because looting disturbed the original arrangement of many tombs before careful documentation could begin. Looting itself becomes part of the modern story. When tombs are opened carelessly, the greatest loss is often not the visible object that disappears, but the relationship between objects. A textile removed from a bundle loses information about which body it covered. A skull moved from one corner of a chamber destroys evidence about burial sequence. A pot sold privately may survive physically, while its archaeological meaning is almost completely erased. At Laguna de los Condores, emergency conservation efforts saved many mummies and objects, but the discovery demonstrates how vulnerable the Chachapoya record remains. Thousands of cliffs, caves, and forested slopes have never been systematically studied. Local communities know of ruins that do not appear in major archaeological surveys. Some sites have already been disturbed. Others may still contain intact tombs protected only by difficult terrain. The faces at Karagia seem to promise certainty because they look directly at the viewer. They appear almost like witnesses, but they do not speak. The mummies beside the lake preserve bodies with extraordinary detail, yet identity remains fragmented. Archaeology can recover age, wounds, textiles, diet, and burial practice. It can map tombs and compare styles. It can show that ancestors occupied powerful positions in the landscape. What it cannot easily recover is the political world those ancestors inhabited. And that political world is becoming increasingly important. Behind the cliff tombs and circular houses are communities capable of conflict as well as cooperation. Some build walls, some place important dead where entire valleys can see them. Local leaders compete for influence. Alliances shift across mountain routes. Before the Inca arrive, the clouds already cover a landscape divided by power. Power in the Chachapoya world does not seem to have flowed from one throne. There is no surviving list of kings, no single royal city that can be securely identified as the undisputed centre of the entire region, and no clear evidence that every settlement from one mountain chain to another obeyed the same ruler. Instead, the landscape suggests something more fragmented. Large communities dominate certain ridges. Smaller settlements cluster around productive valleys. Local leaders organize labor, defend routes, and perhaps claim descent from important ancestors whose tombs overlook the land. Shared traditions connect these communities, but connection does not necessarily mean political unity. This makes the old image of a single Chachapoya kingdom increasingly difficult to maintain. The term is convenient, and later Inca expansion encourages historians to imagine one people facing another in a clear conflict. Archaeology presents a messier reality. Some settlements appear relatively independent. Architectural styles vary. Political authority may have been concentrated at several regional centres rather than one capital. What survives in the records suggests a network of communities linked by cultural practices, exchange, marriage, and perhaps shifting alliances. Such a system can be stable for long periods, but it can also produce competition. Mountain geography creates natural political boundaries. A river gorge separates one valley from another. A ridge controls access to a route. Productive agricultural land is limited. Springs and passes become valuable. When population grows or climate pressures resources, disputes can intensify. A community able to mobilize more labor may expand terraces, build stronger walls, and attract dependents. Its neighbors may respond by strengthening their own positions. Evidence of violence appears in human remains from several sites. Cranial injuries, projectile damage, and other trauma suggest that conflict was not rare. Interpreting these wounds is difficult. Some injuries occur accidentally in steep terrain. Others may result from domestic violence, ritual combat, or interpersonal disputes. Yet repeated patterns of trauma across groups indicate that organized fighting probably formed part of regional life. Scholars still debate how frequent or large-scale warfare became before Inca conquest, but the evidence does not support an entirely peaceful mountain society. The architecture may reflect this uncertainty. High settlements with restricted approaches offer obvious defensive advantages. Massive walls, narrow gateways, and elevated positions could discourage attack. At the same time, many features interpreted as fortifications may also serve ceremonial or political purposes. A wall can defend and impress. A gateway can slow enemies and control ritual access. The same structure can carry different meanings depending on circumstances. Cuelap illustrates the problem particularly well. Its monumental outer walls and narrow entrances seem ideal for defense. Yet the site also contains dense domestic occupation and unusual buildings that may have held ritual significance. If Cuelap was a powerful regional center, its size alone could have made it a target. Rival communities might view its growing influence as a threat. The very labor required to build the site suggests access to a substantial population. Whether through voluntary cooperation, political obligation, or some combination of both. Local leaders probably gained authority by controlling more than military force. In many ancient societies, leadership depends on the ability to distribute food, organize ceremonies, manage disputes, and connect communities through marriage and exchange. Chachapoya elites may have demonstrated power by sponsoring feasts, directing communal labor, and maintaining relationships with ancestral places. Large houses or decorated buildings could signal status. Though archaeologists remain cautious about assigning social rank based on architecture alone, burial practices provide further clues. Elaborate cliff tombs and anthropomorphic sarcophagi require specialized labor and dangerous construction. It is unlikely that every individual receives such treatment. The dead placed at Karasia and similar sites may represent people whose social importance continued after death. Their elevated tombs could reinforce the authority of living descendants. A lineage able to point toward highly visible ancestral monuments possessed a powerful claim to history. This connection between ancestors and politics may have helped stabilize local power. Leadership becomes more convincing when presented as inherited and ancient. A living chief is temporary. A line of ancestors embedded in a cliff appears permanent. Ceremonies associated with the dead could remind communities of obligations, alliances, and territorial claims. The evidence remains incomplete, but the physical placement of high-status burials suggests that memory itself was politically useful. Competition between lineages may also explain some of the region's fragmentation. If authority rested partly on descent and local ancestral claims, creating a unified kingdom would be difficult. A ruler from one valley could not easily erase the sacred histories of neighbouring communities. Alliances might form in response to threats, but they could weaken once the threat passed. Rival leaders could cooperate one year and compete the next. Trade offered another source of influence. The Chachapoya region sits between different ecological zones, and control over mountain routes could provide access to valuable goods moving between the Andes and the eastern forests. Tropical products, feathers, medicinal plants, and other resources from lower areas could travel upward, while highland goods moved east. The precise scale of trade remains debated, but Chachapoya communities were clearly not isolated from broader networks. A settlement positioned near an important route could benefit politically and economically. Travellers need food and shelter. Goods must pass through narrow valleys or ridge crossings. Local leaders might regulate movement, form alliances with traders, or use imported objects to demonstrate prestige. Exotic materials acquire meaning partly because they come from far away. A feather from the lowland forest or a textile influenced by distant traditions can signal connections beyond the local valley. Yet trade routes also create reasons for conflict. Control of movement can be contested. A community that blocks access or demands obligations may provoke resistance. Paths used by merchants can become invasion routes. Knowledge of the terrain gives local fighters enormous advantages. An army unfamiliar with mountain weather and narrow passes can be delayed by relatively small defending forces. This may be one reason the Chachapoya later gain a reputation for resistance. Their political fragmentation, which might seem like weakness, can make conquest complicated. Defeating one major centre does not necessarily secure the next valley. A conqueror must negotiate or fight with multiple leaders. Alliances shift. Communities familiar with hidden routes can withdraw and return. An empire built on clear hierarchies may find a landscape of local powers frustrating. The Chachapoya themselves probably fought one another using weapons common in the ancient Andes: clubs, slings, spears, and other close or ranged weapons could cause the kinds of injuries found on skeletal remains. Slings in particular are dangerous tools in skilled hands, capable of launching stones with considerable force. In open terrain, groups can exchange volleys from a distance, in narrow mountain paths. Even a small number of defenders positioned above an approaching force could create serious difficulty. War would have disrupted daily life quickly. Fields cannot be ignored simply because rival communities are fighting. Harvest schedules continue. Roofs still require maintenance. A prolonged conflict threatens food supplies as much as human life. Settlements may become crowded when people from exposed farms seek safety near fortified centres. Stored maize and tubers gain strategic importance. Paths are watched more carefully. The burial evidence suggests that violence sometimes reached into communities themselves. Not every wound belongs to a formal battlefield. Political rivalry may have involved raids, revenge, and attacks on local leaders. Some episodes could have ended with entire households displaced. Archaeology rarely preserves the names or immediate causes of these conflicts, leaving only damaged bones and burned or abandoned structures. Popular descriptions often treat the Chachapoya as naturally warlike, as though resistance were a permanent personality shared by everyone in the region. That interpretation says more about imperial and colonial stereotypes than about historical reality. Communities fight for specific reasons: land, authority, revenge, security, resources, or survival. The same people who take up weapons also build terraces, weave cloth, raise children, and care for injured relatives. By the 15th century, however, local rivalries begin to matter on a much larger stage. Far to the south and west, an expanding Andean power is absorbing provinces, reorganizing populations, and extending roads through territories that once belonged to independent communities. The Inca do not approach the eastern mountains as curious visitors. They arrive with armies, administrators, and an imperial system designed to turn regional societies into subjects. For fragmented Chachapoya communities, the threat is unprecedented. Old rivalries do not disappear simply because a greater enemy approaches. Some leaders may resist, others may seek accommodation. A few may see the empire as a useful ally against local competitors. The mountain network that has allowed communities to remain distinct now faces a power determined to connect them to a political center hundreds of kilometers away. The clouds still cover the ridges, and local fighters still know every path. But beyond the western mountains, the Inca state is growing toward them. The Inca expansion reaches the Chachapoya from the west, climbing out of the high Andes toward a country the imperial armies do not fully understand. By this stage, the Inca state is no longer a local kingdom centered on Cusco. It has become Tawantinsuyu, a vast political system stretching across much of western South America. Roads link administrative centers, storehouses hold maize, textiles, weapons, and equipment. Officials count obligations and move labor. Conquered rulers are watched. Rewarded, replaced, or absorbed. Armies can be assembled from populations speaking different languages and living hundreds of kilometers apart. To the fragmented communities of the Chachapoya region, this is not simply another rival crossing a ridge. It is a machine of conquest built on organization. Inca expansion is often imagined as a continuous wave moving steadily across a map. On the ground, it is far less smooth. Imperial forces must negotiate with local leaders, secure food, understand unfamiliar routes, and decide which communities can be incorporated peacefully. Some rulers accept Inca authority in exchange for status or protection. Others resist. Military victories do not guarantee permanent control. A valley conquered during one campaign may rebel when the army leaves. Tawantinsuyu grows through repeated pressure rather than one unstoppable march. The Chachapoya territory presents almost every difficulty an empire could dislike. The mountains break large forces into smaller columns. Narrow paths slow movement. Rain damages equipment and turns steep slopes dangerous. Dense vegetation reduces visibility. Supply animals and heavily burdened soldiers cannot move everywhere with equal ease. Local fighters understand alternate routes and can disappear into valleys where imperial troops are unfamiliar with the terrain. The conquest is traditionally associated with the reign of the Inca ruler Tupac Inca Yupanqui during the later 15th century, though the exact chronology and sequence of campaigns remain debated. Spanish chroniclers writing generations later preserve accounts of hard fighting and determined resistance. Their narratives must be treated cautiously. Some exaggerate royal victories to create heroic imperial histories, while others repeat stories shaped by later politics. Still, the repeated association between the Chachapoya and difficult conquest probably reflects genuine instability. Imperial armies eventually push into the region. Settlements submit or are defeated. Local leaders are required to recognize the authority of the Inca ruler. Tribute and labor obligations become part of political life. Roads and administrative systems connect parts of the Chachapoya territory more directly with the broader empire. Inca architectural forms appear at certain sites, standing beside or replacing local traditions. Rectangular buildings associated with imperial organization enter landscapes dominated by circular houses. The contrast in architecture must have been visually striking. Chachapoya settlements grow from round domestic structures and local stone traditions. Inca builders prefer carefully organized rectangular forms for many state facilities. A new imperial building is not simply a different style. It announces that another political order has arrived. Officials, soldiers, messengers, and labor administrators now operate through systems tied to Cusco. Yet the Inca rarely erase local societies completely. Their empire depends on using existing leaders and labor networks whenever possible. A local authority who cooperates may retain influence under imperial supervision. Communities continue farming and maintaining households. Local burial traditions survive, though they change through contact with imperial practices. Chachapoya identity does not vanish on the day of conquest. The transformation is gradual and uneven. Some settlements may experience direct military occupation. Others interact mainly with administrators or nearby Inca centers. Certain families may benefit from the new order. Access to imperial goods, political positions, or protected routes can create opportunities. Other households face increased labor demands and the loss of local autonomy. The same conquest can produce very different experiences within neighboring communities. One of the empire's most powerful tools is labor. Inca authority does not depend primarily on coin taxes. Subject populations owe service. Men and communities can be required to work on roads, agricultural estates, military campaigns, state buildings, and other projects. This system allows Tawantinsuyu to mobilize enormous resources, but it also places pressure on local societies. Time spent serving the state is time away from household fields and community obligations. In a mountain region where survival already depends on careful seasonal labor, these demands can be especially disruptive. Crops do not wait for imperial schedules. Terraces require maintenance. Drainage channels must be cleared before heavy rain. A community sending substantial labor to distant projects may struggle to complete its own work. The Inca state can provide food from storehouses and organize redistribution, but resentment remains possible, particularly where populations remember recent independence. The empire responds to resistance with methods more lasting than battlefield victory. One is forced population movement. Through the Mitma system, communities can be relocated to distant parts of Tawantinsuyu, while groups loyal to the state are settled in strategically important territories. This policy serves several purposes. It spreads specialized skills, strengthens imperial control, reduces the ability of rebellious populations to organize locally, and breaks ties between political resistance and familiar landscapes. For Chachapoya communities, relocation strikes at the foundations of social life. A lineage connected to a particular cliff tomb, ancestral settlement, or valley can be sent far away. Fields inherited through generations are left behind. Local roots become memories. The dead remain in mountains their descendants may never see again. New settlers arrive speaking different languages and carrying different customs. Evidence for Chachapoya people appears in other parts of the Inca world, reflecting these imperial movements. Some may have served as soldiers or laborers. Others were deliberately resettled. The exact numbers remain uncertain, but the policy is recorded strongly enough to show that the Inca considered population transfer necessary in controlling the region. The surprising result is that conquest may actually spread Chachapoya people, while weakening Chachapoya political power at home. Individuals and families carry aspects of their identity into distant provinces. They live among new communities, marry, adapt, and sometimes preserve links to their place of origin. The empire reorganizes human geography as deliberately as Chachapoya builders once reshaped mountain ridges. Back in the eastern Andes, imperial control remains fragile. The old local networks have not disappeared. Mountain communities still know routes beyond the direct reach of administrators. Leaders who publicly accept Inca authority may retain private ambitions. Memories of military defeat survive. Some families have relatives removed by imperial policy. Others see newcomers settled on land connected to local ancestors. Resistance becomes difficult but not impossible. The Inca have considerable advantages. Their roads move messengers rapidly across long distances. Storehouses support armies. Provincial officials gather information. Allied local leaders report unrest. If rebellion grows serious, the empire can send troops drawn from several regions. A Chachapoya community fighting alone faces overwhelming resources. But the terrain changes the balance. The empire cannot place an army on every ridge. It cannot watch every forest path. Local uprisings can begin far from major administrative centers. News takes time to confirm. A defeated group can scatter rather than surrender completely. The Inca may capture an important settlement and still fail to control families living beyond the next chain of mountains. Quelap and other large sites are sometimes drawn directly into stories of Inca conquest. Yet linking specific destruction layers to named historical campaigns remains difficult. Archaeology provides evidence of violence and disruption, but matching a damaged skeleton or burned structure to a particular ruler described by a Spanish chronicler is rarely straightforward. Scholars still debate the sequence of events. The evidence remains incomplete. What can be seen more clearly is cultural intrusion. Inca-style objects appear. Imperial architecture enters the region. Administrative practices alter obligations. Burial traditions at places such as Laguna de los Condores show interaction between local and Inca customs. The conquest reaches into daily life slowly, through objects, labor, marriage, movement, and political pressure. The Chachapoya are now part of the largest empire the Andes have ever seen. Yet incorporation does not create loyalty. Inca power rests heavily on the belief that resistance will fail and punishment will follow. Where that belief weakens, old rivalries and regional identities can return quickly. And in the cloud forests, the empire repeatedly learns that conquering the mountains and keeping them conquered are not the same achievement. Rebellion in the Chachapoya region is not one dramatic uprising followed by silence. It appears instead as a recurring problem, a pattern that forces the Inca state to return again and again to mountains it has already claimed. Submission on an imperial map does not always mean obedience in a distant valley. A local leader may offer tribute while quietly preserving alliances. A community may meet labor obligations for several years, then resist when demands increase or when imperial attention shifts elsewhere. The roads, administrators, and armies of Tawantinsuyu are formidable. But control depends on constant political maintenance. In Chachapoya territory, that maintenance becomes expensive. Spanish chroniclers preserve accounts of repeated Chachapoya resistance, though the details are shaped by generations of retelling. Some narratives describe major revolts suppressed with severe force. Others emphasize the personal intervention of Inca rulers or royal women who supposedly persuaded imperial authorities to show mercy. These stories contain political and moral lessons important to the chroniclers who recorded them, so they cannot be read as simple eyewitness reports. Yet the broader picture is consistent. The region remained unstable after conquest. Why did resistance persist? Geography helps, but terrain alone does not create rebellion. The deeper problem lies in the way Inca rule changes relationships between people, land, and authority. Before imperial expansion, local rivalries may have been intense, but power remained relatively close. A leader lived within the same regional world as the families supplying labor and food. Under Tawantinsuyu, Obligations extend toward a distant ruler in Cusco whose representatives calculate service on an imperial scale. Labor demands become especially visible. Communities are expected to contribute workers to projects that may offer little immediate local benefit. Some men leave home to serve in armies or work on state infrastructure. Others produce goods connected with imperial systems. Local leaders become responsible for meeting quotas and maintaining order. Those who cooperate may receive recognition from the state, but this can place them in an uncomfortable position. They must satisfy Inca officials without losing the support of their own people. The result is a new kind of political tension. A Chachapoya leader who once gained authority through local ancestry and alliances may now depend partly on imperial approval. Neighbors can view cooperation as betrayal. Rivals may use resentment to strengthen their own position. The Inca often preserve existing elites because governing through local authorities is efficient. Yet this strategy also creates fractures inside conquered societies. Forced relocation deepens those fractures. The Mitma system removes some Chachapoya populations and sends them across Tawantinsuyu. In their place, groups from other regions may be settled within the eastern Andes. These newcomers can serve as loyal communities, agricultural specialists, or political buffers. From the imperial perspective, population movement is rational administration. From the perspective of a family removed from ancestral land, it is something else entirely. The loss is not simply economic. Chachapoya identity is physically embedded in the landscape. Ancestors occupy cliffs. Tombs overlook valleys. Houses stand on foundations repaired through generations. Paths connect communities through remembered routes. When people are relocated, the empire cuts through these relationships. A lineage sent hundreds of kilometers away cannot easily visit the tombs that once confirmed its connection to local territory. Some displaced Chachapoya communities appear far from their original homeland. Imperial records preserved through later sources mention Chachapoya populations in regions closer to the central and southern Andes. Their presence demonstrates how thoroughly the Inca can reorganize conquered people. These communities may retain a remembered identity for generations, but life in a new province inevitably changes them. Children grow up among different languages and customs. Marriage creates new ties. Old mountain routes become stories told by parents. At home, the remaining population faces a changed social landscape. New settlers may occupy strategic areas. Imperial officials monitor important routes. Inca administrative sites create centers of authority outside older Chachapoya traditions. Local religious practices continue, but imperial rituals may be introduced. State ceremonies remind communities that they now belong to a larger political world. The Inca are skilled at making empire visible. Roads, storage facilities, plazas, and standardized architecture turn political authority into something physical. State-sponsored festivals and the distribution of food can make imperial rule appear generous. Fine textiles and other prestigious goods reward cooperative leaders. Conquered elites may send children or relatives into imperial institutions, creating personal bonds with the state. This is not control through terror alone. Tawantinsuyu survives because many communities find practical reasons to participate. Roads make movement easier along certain routes. Storehouses can support populations during campaigns or crises. Imperial protection may reduce attacks from old enemies. A local leader backed by Cusco can gain an advantage over rivals. The Inca system creates benefits as well as burdens, and that complexity makes rebellion politically dangerous. A Chachapoya uprising therefore cannot assume that every neighboring community will join. Some families have gained from imperial rule. Others fear punishment. Settlers loyal to the Inca may report preparations. Local leaders may calculate that rebellion has little chance of success and refuse to participate. The fragmented political structure that once complicated Inca conquest now also complicates united resistance. Still, uprisings occur. The exact sequence of revolts is difficult to reconstruct. Chroniclers writing after the Spanish invasion sometimes compress events or attach them to famous Inca rulers. Archaeological evidence can show episodes of violence, but rarely identifies political motives with certainty. Scholars still debate which conflicts belong to pre-Inca rivalry, imperial conquest, or later rebellion. The evidence remains incomplete, and attempts to create a precise year-by-year history risk claiming more than the sources allow. What is clear is that the Inca respond strongly when resistance threatens their authority. Armies can return, leaders may be removed, populations can be relocated. The empire understands that rebellion in one province can encourage unrest elsewhere if left unpunished. Tawantinsuyu is enormous, and much of its stability depends on the reputation of imperial power. A small mountain revolt has consequences beyond the mountains. For ordinary households, suppression must have been terrifying. Soldiers entering a settlement do not experience the landscape as archaeologists later do. They search for leaders, food, and weapons. Houses may be damaged. Stored crops can be seized. Families flee along familiar paths, carrying what they can. An elderly person or injured child slows movement. Fields left unattended become another future disaster. Some people may retreat into more remote areas. The Chachapoya landscape offers hiding places, but living beyond established settlements creates its own difficulties. Food supplies are limited. Shelter must be found. Heavy rain continues regardless of political crisis. An imperial army can leave after a campaign. Displaced families must survive the following season. The trauma of these events may help explain violent deposits found at certain sites, though direct connections remain uncertain. At Cuelap, evidence of violent deaths has encouraged theories involving Inca attack, local conflict, or later events. No single explanation fully accounts for every body or destruction context. What survives is the physical result of instability, without a written testimony from those who endured it. Repeated rebellion also exposes a weakness in the Inca state. The empire is powerful because it can move resources across enormous distances, but that same scale creates dependence on cooperation. Roads require maintenance. Storehouses must be filled. Local officials must report accurately. Armies need food produced by subject communities. If several regions resist simultaneously, imperial strength can become stretched. During the early 16th century, this vulnerability grows more dangerous. A succession crisis divides the Inca royal family. The death of Huayna Capac and his expected heir contributes to a civil war between factions supporting Huáscar and Atahualpa. Armies move across the Andes, provincial loyalties become uncertain, old grievances return. For conquered peoples such as the Chachapoya, imperial conflict creates both danger and opportunity. Some Chachapoya groups become involved in these larger struggles. Their relationship with Inca authority is no longer simply conqueror against conquered. Decades of imperial rule have created Chachapoya soldiers, administrators, displaced communities, and local leaders tied to competing factions. Some resist the empire, others serve within it. The political map has become too tangled for the old image of independent cloud warriors facing a foreign enemy. Then, while the Inca state is divided against itself, strangers appear on the Pacific coast. They are few in number. Their horses are unknown in the Andes. Their weapons and armor are unfamiliar. At first, they are simply another force entering an already unstable political world. Chachapoya leaders do not yet know that these newcomers carry diseases, ambitions, and systems of conquest that will devastate both the Inca and the people who once resisted them. To communities exhausted by imperial pressure, however, the Spanish may initially look less like the end of the world than a possible ally, The first Spanish forces enter the Andes at a moment when the Inca political order is already wounded. The civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa has consumed armies, divided provincial loyalties, and left many conquered peoples watching Cusco with resentment. When Francisco Pizarro and his small expedition move inland in 1532, they do not confront a united empire waiting calmly behind its borders. They enter a continent filled with old rivalries and recent grievances. The Spaniards understand little of this at first, but they learn quickly that enemies of the Inca can become guides, informants, carriers, and soldiers. For some Chachapoya leaders, the arrival of these strangers offers a dangerous possibility. Perhaps one imperial enemy can be used to destroy another. The decision is not difficult to understand when seen from inside the previous decades. The Chachapoya have faced conquest, population transfers, labor obligations, and repeated imperial punishment. Some communities remember rebellion. Others have relatives living far from their ancestral valleys because of Inca relocation policies. Local leaders who lost authority may see the political crisis as a chance to recover it. The Spaniards are unknown, but the Inca are known very well. Spanish chroniclers later emphasize indigenous groups who support the conquest, often presenting their cooperation as proof that Inca rule was universally hated. The reality is more complicated. Alliances change rapidly. Some communities support the Spanish temporarily while others resist. A group can fight alongside Europeans against one Inca faction and later oppose Spanish demands. The evidence remains incomplete. And colonial accounts frequently simplify political choices made under extreme uncertainty. What is clear is that the Spaniards depend heavily on indigenous allies. Their numbers are far too small to conquer the Andes through European soldiers alone. Horses, steel weapons, and firearms create tactical advantages, especially during sudden attacks, but they do not magically allow a few hundred men to occupy thousands of mountain communities. The conquest becomes possible through alliances with populations that provide local knowledge and large numbers of fighters. Chachapoya groups are among those drawn into this shifting coalition. Some assist the Spaniards against Inca forces. Their knowledge of eastern routes and mountain terrain is valuable. Local leaders may hope that cooperation will bring autonomy or protection. Perhaps they imagine the Spaniards as another temporary political faction, dangerous but manageable. In the Andes, powerful outsiders have come before. Alliances with distant rulers can be renegotiated. The fatal misunderstanding is scale. The Spanish do not intend simply to defeat one Inca dynasty and withdraw. They bring a system of permanent colonial occupation supported by the Spanish crown, Christian institutions, private ambitions, and an expanding Atlantic economy. Conquistadors expect land, labor, treasure, and political rewards. Priests seek conversion. Officials eventually seek regular taxation and centralized administration. The alliance that appears useful in a moment of war becomes the entrance to an entirely different kind of domination. At first, however, everything happens quickly. Atahualpa is captured at Cajamarca in November 1532 after a carefully planned Spanish attack. Thousands of his followers are killed in the confusion. The Inca ruler offers an enormous ransom, filling rooms with gold and silver, but he is executed in 1533. The political shock travels across the Andes. A man who had commanded armies and claimed imperial authority is suddenly a prisoner, then dead. For communities long intimidated by Inca power, the event must have been almost impossible to interpret. The empire has not vanished. Inca generals still command troops. Administrative networks continue. Local officials remain in place. Yet the sacred and political authority of the ruler has suffered a public catastrophe. Old calculations change overnight. Some Chachapoya leaders strengthen cooperation with the Spanish. They provide assistance in campaigns and attempt to position themselves as allies rather than conquered subjects. Spanish narratives sometimes praise these groups as loyal friends. Such language should be treated cautiously. Loyalty in colonial sources often means usefulness to Spanish objectives. A community described as friendly may simply have decided that resistance at that moment was more dangerous. The Chachapoya are not alone in making this choice. Huanca, Cañari, and other indigenous populations also form alliances with Spanish forces for their own reasons. The conquest of the Inca Empire is therefore partly an Andean civil conflict redirected by European invaders. Spaniards place themselves at the centre of existing rivalries, promising support, rewarding allies temporarily, and presenting their enemies as common threats. The strategy is devastatingly effective because information is uneven. Chachapoya communities know the Inca. They do not yet understand Spain. They cannot see across the Atlantic to the monarchy claiming authority over lands Europeans have barely entered. They do not know how many more settlers may eventually arrive. They cannot predict colonial courts, encomiendas, forced resettlement, Christian campaigns against indigenous religious practices, or the demographic disasters already beginning through disease. Disease may have reached parts of the Andes even before many communities see a Spaniard. Smallpox and other Old World infections spread through human contact faster than European armies can travel. The exact timing and paths of individual epidemics remain debated. But the broader demographic effect is beyond doubt. Indigenous populations with no previous exposure to several Eurasian diseases suffer catastrophic mortality over the following decades. For Chachapoya communities, epidemic disease strikes societies already disrupted by Inca conquest and relocation. A village can lose farmers at the beginning of a planting season. A local leader may die without an experienced successor. People responsible for maintaining oral histories disappear. Children lose parents. Ritual specialists who know burial traditions and ancestral genealogies die before passing their knowledge fully to younger generations. Disease does not attack political structures deliberately, but its effects are political. A community that loses a large portion of its population cannot meet the same labour demands. Terraces fall out of use. Drainage systems receive less maintenance. Paths become overgrown. Survivors move into larger settlements or join relatives elsewhere. The landscape begins changing because there are fewer people available to keep it organised. The Spaniards often interpret this disruption through their own interests. Populations are counted according to tribute and labour potential. Conquistadors receive encomiendas, grants allowing them to demand tribute from designated indigenous communities under the claim that they will provide protection and Christian instruction. In practice, the system creates enormous opportunities for exploitation. Chachapoya allies who expected political freedom discover that Spanish friendship does not remove obligations. It changes the person collecting them. Some local elites attempt to adapt. Cooperation remains a survival strategy. Leaders learn how to petition colonial officials, use interpreters, and present older rights in forms the Spanish legal system might recognize. Indigenous communities across the Andes prove remarkably skilled at using colonial courts when opportunities exist. Yet legal negotiation takes place within a system built on conquest. A successful petition may protect one piece of land while the wider society continues to collapse. Christian missionaries enter the region and challenge religious practices connected with ancestors, sacred landscapes, and local ritual specialists. Tombs and mummies can become targets because colonial religious authorities often interpret indigenous veneration of the dead as idolatry. Campaigns to destroy traditional religious objects occur across Peru. The degree of destruction varies locally, but the pressure is profound. Practices maintained for centuries become dangerous to perform openly. The cliff tombs remain, but the relationships around them begin to break. A family relocated into a colonial settlement may live far from ancestral burials. A converted leader may publicly reject older ceremonies. A ritual specialist may continue practices in secret. The dead still look over the valleys, but fewer people climb toward them carrying the same offerings. Spanish colonial authorities also encourage or force dispersed indigenous populations into concentrated settlements, often called reducciones. The policy aims to make taxation, labor recruitment, and Christian conversion easier. For mountain societies accustomed to numerous settlements spread across difficult terrain, concentration produces another major transformation. People leave circular houses, ridges, and local agricultural systems to live in communities organized according to colonial plans. The old cities are not abandoned in one sudden wave. Some remain occupied, others decline gradually. Families return to fields or ancestral places even when officials prefer them elsewhere. Colonial control is uneven, especially in remote mountains. But population loss and restructuring create a long movement away from many pre-Hispanic settlements. The Chachapoya had tried to use the Spanish against the Inca, and in the immediate political struggle the alliance helped destroy imperial authority. Yet victory does not restore the world that existed before Tupac Inca Yupanqui's armies entered the cloud forests. Too much has already changed. The Inca system collapses, but the Spanish build another system over its ruins. There is a bitter historical pattern in this outcome, though it should not be mistaken for foolishness on the part of Chachapoya leaders. They make decisions with the information available to them. The Inca threat is immediate and familiar. The future Spanish colonial order is impossible to see clearly in 1532. Political survival often requires choosing between dangers without knowing which one will become permanent. Within only a few generations, disease and displacement will accomplish what imperial armies never fully managed. Settlements once filled with hundreds of circular houses grow quiet. Paths vanish beneath vegetation. Monumental walls remain standing while the communities that maintain them shrink or move away. The Cloud Warriors are not defeated in one final battle. Their cities simply begin to lose their people. The silence does not arrive everywhere at once. One settlement loses half its households and continues with fewer fires burning at night. Another is abandoned after survivors move closer to a colonial town where tribute is counted and priests can reach them more easily. A mountain path remains open for a few years, then becomes narrow as vegetation closes from both sides. A roof collapses during the rainy season and no one returns to rebuild it. Water enters the house. Seeds take root in the floor. A wall that stood through generations begins to lean. Across the Chachapoya landscape, the disappearance of cities is not a single event, but the slow accumulation of absences. Epidemic disease is one of the greatest forces behind this transformation. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other infections introduced from the Old World move through indigenous populations with devastating effect. Exact mortality figures for the Chachapoya region are difficult to establish because colonial records are incomplete and often begin after major population losses have already occurred. Scholars still debate the scale of individual epidemics in particular valleys, but the broader pattern across the Andes is unmistakable. Communities decline rapidly during the 16th century, sometimes experiencing repeated waves of disease before they can recover from the previous outbreak. The human consequences extend far beyond death counts. A settlement can survive the loss of buildings more easily than the loss of knowledge. When experienced farmers die, younger relatives may not know every detail of planting schedules across several elevations. When builders disappear, drainage systems are maintained less effectively. When ritual specialists die, funerary ceremonies change. Oral histories break at precisely the moment when communities need them to remember older boundaries and alliances. The age pattern of death can be especially destructive. Epidemics often affect whole families, removing adults responsible for both labor and cultural transmission. Children survive without parents. Elderly people who carry memories of pre-Inca or early imperial times vanish. Local leaders die during political uncertainty, leaving successors to negotiate with Spanish officials under unfamiliar rules. A community that has lost a quarter, half, or perhaps more of its population is not simply a smaller version of what existed before. Its entire social structure changes. Colonial policies intensify the disruption. Spanish authorities prefer populations that can be counted, taxed, converted, and recruited for labor. Dispersed mountain settlements are inconvenient. The old Chachapoya pattern of communities spread across ridges and ecological zones does not fit easily into colonial administration. People are encouraged or compelled to move into concentrated towns, often laid out around a church and central plaza. These settlements alter the geography of daily life. A family that once lived near particular fields or ancestral tombs may now travel farther to reach them. Some agricultural areas become difficult to maintain. Paths connecting older villages receive less use. Colonial roads and administrative routes grow more important while local networks decline. The landscape begins to reorganize around new centers of authority. The process is rarely complete. Indigenous communities do not simply obey every colonial order and abandon older places immediately. Families return to fields. People maintain hidden ritual sites. Some settlements remain occupied well into the colonial period. Others are reused temporarily. The evidence remains incomplete, and different valleys experience change at different speeds. Yet the long-term direction is clear. Many major pre-Hispanic settlements lose population. Cuelap, once crowded with circular buildings, gradually becomes a place associated more with the past than ordinary domestic life. Houses collapse, vegetation enters courtyards. The drainage systems that once required constant maintenance begin to fail. Water does the rest patiently. Rain enters cracks. Stone fill becomes saturated. Soil shifts. A small collapse changes the route of runoff, directing more water toward another wall. Tree roots grow between masonry blocks and expand. Moss covers surfaces. Organic material accumulates on platforms, creating soil where there was once swept ground. Birds and small animals occupy structures that once held human households. Within a surprisingly short time, the forest changes how ruins are seen. A settlement built to dominate a ridge can disappear beneath vegetation when viewed from a neighboring mountain. Walls merge with natural rock. Paths vanish. Even local residents may know only portions of extensive archaeological landscapes hidden close to their farms. This concealment later feeds the language of lost cities. European travellers and modern explorers sometimes describe Chachapoya sites as if they had been completely forgotten by humanity until outsiders rediscovered them. In reality, local communities often knew ruins existed. Farmers used nearby land. Hunters passed walls. Stories survived around certain cliffs and buildings. What was lost was not always knowledge of a place's existence, but detailed memory of who built it and why. That distinction matters. A ruin can remain physically familiar while historically mysterious. People may know that old houses cover a ridge but no longer remember the names of the families who occupied them. A cliff tomb may inspire fear or respect even after the rituals once performed there disappear. Colonial disruption separates landscape from explanation. The Spanish contribute to this break by changing naming systems. Indigenous place names are recorded unevenly, altered through European spelling, or replaced. Populations move, taking some names with them and leaving others behind. Administrative districts combine communities that once considered themselves separate. Over generations, political geography becomes increasingly difficult to compare with the archaeological record. Funerary traditions suffer similar fragmentation. Some tombs are looted during the colonial period or later. Others are damaged during campaigns against indigenous religious practices. Mummy bundles may be removed, burned, or scattered. Yet the most inaccessible cliff tombs survive because even determined intruders cannot easily reach them. The same dangerous placement chosen by Chachapoya communities centuries earlier becomes an accidental defense against destruction. Inside abandoned houses, archaeologists later find evidence of sudden and gradual departure mixed together. Some structures contain broken household objects left where they fell. Others appear deliberately cleared. A settlement may shrink before final abandonment, with families concentrating in one area while peripheral buildings collapse. There is rarely a single dramatic last day. This is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Chachapoya decline. No final army necessarily stands outside the walls. No trumpet announces the end. 1 year, fewer roofs are repaired. Another year, an old path receives less traffic. A household moves to join relatives in a colonial town and leaves its stone foundation behind. Eventually, no one remembers exactly when the last fire went out. The people themselves do not disappear. This is essential. Chachapoya descendants survive colonial rule, intermarry, migrate, and remain part of the populations of northern Peru. Cultural practices change, languages shift, and identities are transformed through centuries of political pressure. The archaeological culture called Chachapoya ends as a distinct pre-Hispanic social world, but its people are not erased from human history. The myth of total disappearance is partly created by the ruins. Visitors see empty cities and assume the population vanished. Archaeology tells a more complex story of demographic collapse, forced movement, adaptation, and survival. Some families remain near ancestral lands. Others enter new colonial communities. Chachapoya identity becomes layered with broader indigenous and local identities. Still, something profound is lost. The political networks connecting mountain settlements break apart. The meaning of decorative stone patterns fades. The names of local leaders vanish. Oral histories that once explained cliff tombs are interrupted. When Spanish chroniclers describe the Chachapoya, they record only fragments, often through the lens of conquest. Centuries pass. Cuelap stands above the valleys, damaged but immense. Caragia's human-shaped sarcophagi continue staring outward. Mummies remain sealed near remote lakes. Forest grows over circular houses by the thousands. And into the silence left by broken memory, new stories begin to enter. Some are based on early colonial descriptions. Others are inventions shaped by European fascination with mysterious white-skinned tribes, lost travelers, and civilizations supposedly too unusual to have developed in the Americas on their own. The abandoned cities become perfect ground for myths, and the cloud warriors are about to receive an identity they never claimed. The myth begins with a few lines written by men who arrive after the Chachapoya world has already been transformed. Spanish chroniclers describe people from the region as physically attractive, sometimes unusually fair in complexion compared with populations they had encountered elsewhere, and later readers seize on those observations. Over centuries, brief descriptions harden into claims. The Chachapoya become pale-skinned mountain warriors. Then they become a mysterious white tribe. Eventually, popular writers connect them to Vikings, Celts, Phoenicians, or other travelers supposedly carried across the Atlantic long before Columbus. The ruins in the clouds seem to encourage the fantasy. Massive walls, strange sarcophagi, and forgotten settlements are presented as evidence that someone foreign must have arrived. It is a familiar pattern in the history of archaeology when an indigenous society appears impressive or unusual. Outsiders begin searching for a distant civilization to receive the credit. The colonial descriptions themselves require careful reading. Spanish writers often categorized indigenous populations using European ideas about appearance, beauty, and social distinction. A statement that one group seemed lighter than another is not a genetic study. Skin color can vary naturally within and between indigenous South American populations, and observations made by a handful of chroniclers may reflect limited encounters, clothing, social status, geography. And even the expectations of the writer can influence how people are described. The evidence remains incomplete, but nothing in the historical accounts requires a European origin. Nevertheless, the image spreads because it offers an easy mystery. A mountain civilization with circular houses and cliff burials already feels distant from the better-known cultures of coastal Peru. Add descriptions of fair skin, and a dramatic story seems to assemble itself. Popular books and television programs begin asking whether lost Europeans crossed the Atlantic and built cities in the Andes. The question sounds adventurous. The problem is that archaeology does not support the answer. Chachapoya architecture develops within a South American context. Circular stone buildings have regional precedents and parallels. Agricultural practices fit Andean adaptations to vertical environments. Funerary traditions belong to broader indigenous South American patterns of ancestor veneration, body preservation, and sacred geography, even while remaining locally distinctive. Pottery, textiles, and settlement organization show interaction with neighboring Andean cultures. Not a sudden arrival of foreign colonists carrying a separate technological tradition. If a substantial Viking or Celtic population had established itself in the Chachapoya region, archaeologists would expect material traces, foreign metal technologies, unmistakable weapon forms, imported domestic objects, ship-related traditions, or a sudden break in local cultural development might appear. None of this has been found in convincing archaeological contexts. No runic inscriptions emerge from sealed Chachapoya layers. No European-style graves appear beneath the mountain settlements. No collection of pre-Columbian North Atlantic artifacts connects the region to medieval Europe. Genetic research also fails to support the popular theory of a hidden European colony. Studies of ancient and modern indigenous populations in Peru place Chachapoya-related ancestry within the broader history of native South American populations. The genetic picture is complex, as it should be in a region shaped by migration, Inca relocation, colonial disruption, and later intermarriage. But complexity is not evidence for Vikings. Claims of ancient European ancestry often depend on selective interpretation, contaminated samples, or a misunderstanding of how genetic variation works. The Chachapoya were not completely isolated, and this point is sometimes distorted by fringe theories. They interacted with other indigenous populations. People moved between highlands, valleys, and eastern forests. Inca policies later relocated Chachapoya communities across the empire and settled outsiders in their homeland. Genetic diversity and cultural exchange are therefore expected. The mistake is assuming that every unusual trait must come from across an ocean. Even the famous sarcophagi have been pulled into the argument. The tall human-shaped figures at Karagia are occasionally compared with European or Mediterranean artistic traditions. Yet resemblance is a weak form of evidence. Human societies repeatedly create upright figures with faces because the human body has the inconvenient habit of looking roughly similar everywhere. A long nose painted on a clay funerary figure does not establish transatlantic migration. The sarcophagi make sense within Chachapoya mortuary practices and the local emphasis on visible ancestral presence. The monumental walls of Cuelap receive similar treatment. Popular accounts sometimes describe the site as too sophisticated for an indigenous mountain population, though the statement collapses under even basic archaeological examination. Chachapoya builders lived in the region for centuries. Their construction techniques develop through repeated adaptation to rain, slope, and local stone. The engineering visible at Cuelap is impressive precisely because it grows from long experience with the eastern Andes. Invoking foreign architects explains nothing and removes the achievement from the people whose settlements surround the site. Why, then, do these stories remain so persistent? Part of the answer is simple drama. A lost Viking colony in Peru makes a more sensational headline than generations of indigenous communities developing regional architectural traditions. Fringe theories offer a single surprising event. Real history often offers slow change, uncertain chronology, and several causes operating at once. The first is easier to package. There is also a deeper cultural habit at work. For centuries, European and later North American writers often struggled to accept that complex American civilizations developed independently. Mounds in North America were once attributed to vanished foreign peoples rather than the ancestors of living indigenous communities. Great ruins in Central and South America inspired theories involving Egyptians, Israelites, Phoenicians, and the lost continent of Atlantis. The pattern repeatedly shifts achievement away from indigenous people toward imagined outsiders. The Chachapoya are especially vulnerable to this because their own written voice is absent. No local chronicle survives to correct a Viking fantasy. No Chachapoya author explains why circular houses were built or what the cliff tombs meant. Colonial descriptions leave gaps, and gaps invite invention. The more dramatic the ruins, the more eagerly those inventions spread. Modern tourism can unintentionally reinforce the problem. Phrases such as mysterious white warriors or lost race of the Andes attract attention. They create a memorable identity for a region competing with internationally famous sites such as Machu Picchu. Yet repetition gives unsupported claims the appearance of evidence. A visitor hears the story from a guide, repeats it online, and another article cites the repeated version as though it were established history. Scholars still debate many genuine Chachapoya questions. The degree of political unity remains uncertain. Population movement before the Inca is not fully understood. The meanings of geometric friezes and certain funerary designs remain unresolved. The relationship between regional centres requires further excavation. These are real mysteries grounded in incomplete evidence. They do not become less interesting simply because Vikings are removed from the story. In fact, the Chachapoya become more impressive when foreign origin myths are set aside. Their cities emerge through local adaptation to one of the most difficult inhabited landscapes in South America. Communities develop ways to build on unstable ridges, manage heavy rain, move between ecological zones, and preserve ancestors and cliffs. They create distinctive architecture while remaining connected to the wider Andes. Their history includes rivalry, imperial conquest, rebellion, alliance, epidemic collapse, and survival. None of that requires a lost European expedition. The persistence of the white cloud warrior myth reveals how easily uncertainty can be mistaken for permission to invent. A missing answer does not make every answer equally likely. Archaeology moves more slowly. It compares artifacts, dates layers, studies human remains, and revises conclusions when new evidence appears. This method rarely produces the clean legends popular culture prefers, but it brings the Chachapoya closer to their own history. And that history is still emerging. Across northern Peru, forested ridges continue to hide structures. New surveys reveal settlements larger than expected. Remote tombs remain undocumented. Modern technology is beginning to see through vegetation that once made regional mapping almost impossible. The most important Chachapoya discoveries may not involve proving an exotic visitor ever reached the clouds. They may come from realizing just how much of the indigenous landscape is still there, waiting beneath the forest. The forest still keeps secrets, but it no longer hides them as completely as it once did. From the ground, a Chachapoya ridge can appear to be nothing more than an unbroken wall of vegetation. Trees rise above thick undergrowth. Vines cross old paths. Moss covers stone until walls resemble natural outcrops. An archaeologist walking through such terrain may pass within meters of a structure and fail to see its full shape. From above, however, the landscape is beginning to change. Remote sensing, aerial photography, satellite imagery, drones, and increasingly detailed digital mapping are allowing researchers to examine the eastern Andes on a scale earlier generations could barely attempt. The result is not the discovery of one hidden capital that suddenly explains everything. It is something more significant, a growing realization that the Chachapoya world may have been far more densely built, connected, and complicated than the famous ruins alone suggest. Surveys continue to identify settlement remains across ridges and valleys of northern Peru. Circular foundations appear beneath vegetation. Walls extend beyond the areas first recorded by explorers. Old routes connect clusters of buildings separated by terrain that seems nearly impassable to visitors unfamiliar with the mountains. Some sites contain dozens of structures, others contain hundreds. Not every ruin can be dated immediately. And not every circular building automatically belongs to the same period. But the expanding archaeological map challenges the idea of a few isolated cities floating above an empty jungle. The landscape increasingly looks inhabited on a regional scale. This matters because older interpretations often depended heavily on spectacular sights. Cuelap dominated discussion because its monumental walls were impossible to ignore. Caragia became famous because its human-shaped sarcophagi created unforgettable images. Laguna de los Condres drew attention through its remarkable preserved mummies. Yet civilizations are not made only from their most dramatic places. Small settlements, agricultural slopes, minor paths, ordinary cemeteries, and abandoned household compounds may provide the evidence needed to understand how the Chachapoya population actually functioned. The challenge is enormous. Archaeological work in cloud forest is slow, expensive, and physically demanding. Equipment must be carried along difficult routes. Rain interrupts excavation. Soil conditions can change quickly. Vegetation removed for documentation often returns. A site mapped one season may require major clearing again a few years later. Landslides can destroy deposits before they are studied. Looters can reach a newly exposed tomb faster than researchers or authorities. Modern conservation presents its own contradictions. Clearing vegetation allows walls to be recorded and visited, but removing roots can destabilize masonry that has adjusted around them for decades. Heavy tourism can damage fragile surfaces. New roads bring economic opportunity to remote communities while also making archaeological sites easier to loot. The question is no longer simply how to discover Chachapoya ruins. It is how to protect a landscape containing more sites than can realistically be excavated or restored. Cuelap demonstrates the problem with painful clarity. Sections of its monumental walls have suffered serious structural collapse in recent years, drawing attention to long-term drainage problems, rainfall, geological instability, vegetation, and the difficulty of conserving an enormous ancient platform. The original builders maintained the site through continual labor. Modern conservation teams inherit the structure without the living community that once cleared channels, repaired walls, and noticed small changes before they became emergencies. There is a quiet irony in this. For centuries, The ruins survived partly because of remoteness. The forest concealed them from large-scale development and, in some cases, from intensive looting. Now greater attention brings funding, research, and visitors, but it also introduces new pressure. The Chachapoya sites are becoming more visible at precisely the moment changing rainfall patterns, erosion, tourism, and human expansion create additional risks. The people living in the region today are not spectators standing outside this history. Communities throughout Amazonas and neighboring areas maintain deep relationships with the same mountains, fields, and valleys. Some families live near archaeological sites known locally long before they appeared in academic publications. Farmers discover ceramics or walls while working land. Guides learn the location of remote ruins from parents and grandparents. Local knowledge often becomes the starting point for formal archaeological investigation. The phrase surviving descendants must be used carefully. 5 centuries of Inca relocation, Spanish colonial movement, epidemic loss, migration, and intermarriage make simple lines of descent difficult to trace. Modern populations cannot be treated as frozen representatives of a pre-Hispanic culture. Yet it is equally wrong to speak as though the Chachapoya vanished biologically and left an empty landscape later occupied by unrelated people. Genetic and historical evidence points towards survival, mixing, movement, and continuity within broader indigenous Andean populations. Identity changes because history changes. A person living in the region today may identify through a village, province, indigenous heritage, family history, or national identity rather than using an archaeological term created from colonial records. The absence of a community calling itself a Chachapoya kingdom does not mean the ancient population disappeared without descendants. Civilizations can end while people survive. This distinction may be one of the most important lessons offered by the ruins. Archaeologists often name cultures according to pottery, architecture, or geography. These labels help organize evidence, but ancient people did not necessarily divide themselves according to the categories later placed on museum displays. The Chachapoya cultural tradition changes under Inca influence, then colonial rule, yet human lives continue beyond those boundaries. New research is also making the old story of isolation harder to defend. Scientific analysis of human remains, ceramics, textiles, and settlement patterns suggests movement and interaction across regions. Isotopic studies can sometimes identify individuals who spent childhood in environments different from those where they were buried. Genetic research reveals patterns shaped by both local continuity and population movement. Imported styles show contact with the wider Andes. The cloud warriors were never sealed behind the clouds. They lived at a crossroads between ecological worlds. To the west rose the high Andes and political centers that would eventually produce the Inca Empire. To the east stretched vast lowland forests connected through rivers and exchange routes. Chachapoya communities occupied difficult terrain, but difficulty did not prevent communication. It shaped the form communication took. Many questions remain unresolved. Archaeologists still debate the precise political organization of the region before Inca conquest. Was Quelap one powerful center among several, or did it exercise authority across a wider territory? Did major settlements form competing alliances? How much warfare occurred before the Inca arrived? What did geometric friezes communicate? Why were certain individuals placed in anthropomorphic sarcophagi, while others entered collective mausoleums? How did local religious specialists understand the mountains and the preserved dead? Even population size remains uncertain. Dense settlement evidence suggests large numbers of inhabitants in some areas, but estimating ancient populations from house counts is difficult. Not every structure was occupied simultaneously. Some buildings changed function. Settlements grew and contracted, until more sites are securely dated. any single total risks creating false precision. There may also be entire categories of evidence still hidden. Organic objects decay rapidly in wet environments. Wooden carvings, baskets, ropes, tools, and ritual materials may have vanished from ordinary settlements. Oral traditions disappeared without being recorded. Painted surfaces faded. Metal objects were removed or recycled. Archaeology reconstructs the Chachapoya world from what survived, and survival is never neutral. The cliffs offer better preservation but remain difficult to reach. Undocumented tombs almost certainly exist across the region. Their discovery creates ethical and practical concerns. Human remains are not simply scientific samples. They are the bodies of people connected to living communities and landscapes. Researchers increasingly confront questions about conservation, local consultation, museum storage, and the respectful study of ancient individuals. There is no final excavation that will answer everything. Each discovery changes the questions. A newly mapped settlement may weaken an old theory of political isolation. A genetic sample may reveal unexpected movement. A construction phase at Kuelap may show that a building once treated as a single monument developed over generations. The Chachapoya become less simple as evidence improves. That complexity is perhaps the clearest surviving trace of the real society. They were not merely warriors. They were not a lost white tribe. They were not people permanently hidden from the wider Andes. They were farmers, builders, travellers, local rivals, imperial subjects, rebels, allies, ancestors, and survivors. Their communities adapted to steep ground with a patience visible in stone platforms and drainage systems. Their dead occupied cliffs where painted faces still look across valleys. Their political fragmentation frustrated the Inca, then shaped dangerous alliances during the Spanish invasion. The clouds protected parts of this history, but they also helped erase it. Moisture destroyed ordinary objects, forest-covered roads, mountain isolation limited early research. The same landscape that preserved remote tombs allowed entire settlements to disappear from wider view. Even now, a person can stand on one ridge and look toward another covered completely in green, unaware that beneath the trees are circular foundations, collapsed walls, and paths built by people whose names have been lost. There may be no gold there, no royal tomb, no dramatic inscription waiting to rewrite world history. Perhaps only houses, but houses may be exactly what is needed. Because the real Chachapoya mystery has never depended on a single treasure. It lies in the scale of a human world almost removed from memory. Every newly mapped settlement adds another group of families to the landscape. Every ancient trail shows another connection. Every repaired foundation records another decision to remain in the mountains despite rain, distance, and political danger. The cities above the jungle were not impossible places built by impossible people. They were homes, and across the eastern Andes, beneath moving clouds and growing forest, many of those homes are still waiting to be counted. The ridge grows quiet again when the visitors leave. Clouds move slowly across the upper walls, passing through ruined doorways and over the places where roofs once stood. Rain gathers on leaves, falls onto ancient stone, and follows channels that may have been planned by builders more than 1,000 years ago. Far below, rivers continue cutting through valleys as they did before Kuelap rose, and as they will long after its walls finally surrender to the mountain. Civilizations often appear permanent from inside themselves. A child born in a crowded settlement sees houses already old, paths worn by generations, and tombs containing ancestors whose names carry authority. The world seems established. The walls have always been there. The fields will be planted again. Someone will clear the drain before the rains. Then history alters the rhythm. An empire arrives, Families are moved. A disease crosses distances no one can see. Languages change. Old ceremonies become dangerous. Fewer hands repair the walls. Eventually, the forest enters through an abandoned doorway and begins a patient kind of rebuilding. Yet disappearance is rarely complete. Stone survives. Bloodlines continue in complicated directions. A place name remains. A farmer notices a wall beneath roots. A child grows up beside a cliff where figures stand looking across the valley, though the story of the people inside them has been partly lost. The Chachapoya remind us that history is not only preserved in palaces, armies, and written names. Sometimes it waits inside a circular foundation beneath moss. Sometimes it is held in the healed bone of an injured person cared for centuries ago. Sometimes it is a path between two mountains, almost invisible now, proving the people once crossed regularly where modern eyes see only wilderness. And perhaps that is the final image to keep. Not warriors frozen forever in battle, not a vanished race swallowed by clouds, but people walking home along a high ridge as evening settles over the eastern Andes. They carry food from the fields. Smoke rises from circular houses ahead. Above them, ancestors rest in cliffs. Below them, the forest stretches toward a horizon already disappearing into mist. For a moment, the city is alive. The paths are known, and every stone still has a name. Then the clouds move in,